Throughout human history, medicine has been a field of both remarkable achievement and profound tragedy. For every breakthrough that has saved lives, there have been treatments that caused suffering, experiments that went terribly wrong, and practices that, with the benefit of hindsight, seem almost incomprehensible. Tonight we'll explore some of the darkest chapters in medical history, not to sensationalize, but to understand how even the most well-intentioned efforts to heal can sometimes harm. This is a journey built on documented evidence, historical records, and the careful work of medical historians who have examined these events with both rigor and compassion. We'll look at treatments that were once considered cutting edge, only to be revealed as dangerous or even deadly. We'll meet the patients who suffered, the doctors who believed they were helping, and the whistleblowers who fought to expose the truth. These aren't just stories of medical failure. They're human stories that reveal how scientific understanding evolves, how commercial pressures can compromise safety, and how the road to medical progress has often been paved with painful lessons. We'll take our time tonight. These subjects deserve careful consideration, not rushed judgment. Each chapter will allow us to examine the context of its era, to understand why intelligent people made the choices they did, and to reflect on what these episodes teach us about medicine today. Some of these stories may be difficult to hear, but they're important, because remembering the mistakes of the past helps us build a safer, more ethical future. Here's what we'll explore together over the next 2.5 hours. We'll begin with trepanation, one of humanity's oldest surgical procedures, drilling holes into the skull, and discover that ancient surgeons achieved survival rates that would surprise us. Then we'll examine bloodletting, a practice that dominated Western medicine for 2,000 years, based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how the body works. We'll encounter radium, once celebrated as a miracle substance, and added to everything from drinking water to cosmetics before its deadly effects became clear. We'll hear the story of the Radium Girls, young women who painted watch dials and paid with their lives, but whose legal battle changed workplace safety forever. And we'll meet Frances Kelsey, the FDA officer whose careful scrutiny saved America from the Thalidomide disaster that devastated thousands of families in Europe. We'll explore lobotomy, a procedure that won its inventor a Nobel Prize, yet left thousands of patients permanently damaged. We'll learn about Walter Freeman, the doctor who performed over 3,000 lobotomies and traveled the country in his lobotomobile, convinced he was helping people even as evidence mounted against him. We'll look at how mercury, a toxic metal, was used for centuries to treat everything from syphilis to constipation. We'll discover how cocaine was once prescribed by Sigmund Freud as a wonder drug, and how Bayer marketed heroin as a safe cough medicine for children. We'll examine electroshock therapy and insulin shock therapy treatments that were sometimes effective but often abused, and which remain controversial to this day. And we'll reflect on what all these stories teach us about the importance of rigorous, testing-informed consent and the ethical frameworks that now guide medical research. Each of these chapters reveals something essential about the relationship between hope and harm, between innovation and caution, between the desire to heal and the responsibility to do no harm. Let's begin. Holes drilled into the skull, mankind's first surgery. In 1865, a French physician named Paul Broca examined a human skull that had been excavated from a Neolithic burial site in the Lozère region of southern France. What caught his attention immediately was a carefully crafted rectangular opening in the cranium, measuring approximately 4 centimeters across. The edges of this opening were smooth and showed clear signs of healing. The bone had begun to regenerate around the wound. This meant something remarkable. The person who underwent this procedure had survived. They had lived for weeks, perhaps months, or even years after someone had deliberately cut a hole into their skull. Broca's discovery was not an isolated case. As archaeological excavations expanded across Europe, Asia, and the Americas throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, researchers began finding similar skulls with deliberate openings. The practice known as trepanation or trepanation appeared to be one of humanity's oldest surgical procedures. What made these findings particularly intriguing was not just their age, some dating back more than 7,000 years, but the evidence that many patients had survived what we might assume would be a fatal operation. The questions these discoveries raised were profound. Why would ancient peoples working with stone tools and no understanding of modern anatomy choose to cut into the human skull? What conditions were they attempting to treat? And perhaps most puzzling of all, how did so many patients survive? Let's consider what the archaeological evidence tells us. Trepanned skulls have been found at sites spanning an extraordinary geographic range. In Peru, archaeologists have discovered hundreds of skulls showing evidence of trepanation, some dating to around 400 BCE. The Paracas culture, which flourished along Peru's southern coast, appears to have developed particularly sophisticated techniques. Researchers examining these skulls have identified several different methods. Some show evidence of scraping, where the surgeon gradually abraded the bone away in circular motions. Others display clean cuts, suggesting the use of sharp obsidian blades to create rectangular or square openings. In France, at sites in the Lozère and Marne regions, Neolithic skulls reveal similar procedures performed between 6500 and 3500 BCE. These European examples often show circular openings created by cutting a groove around the perimeter and then removing the central disc of bone. The Chinese archaeological record also contains evidence of trepanation, though less extensively documented than in Europe or South America. What makes these findings particularly significant is the evidence of survival and healing. When bone is cut and the person dies shortly afterward, the edges remain sharp and show no signs of regeneration. But many ancient trepanned skulls show rounded edges and new bone growth, clear indicators that the patient lived long enough for healing to occur. Some skulls even show evidence of multiple procedures performed at different times, suggesting that certain individuals underwent trepanation more than once during their lifetime. The survival rates, particularly in ancient Peru, are striking when compared to later surgical practices. Research conducted by bioarchaeologist John Verano of Tulane University examined over 800 trepanned skulls from Peru, spanning nearly 2,000 years. His analysis revealed that survival rates improved dramatically over time. In the earliest period around 400 BCE, approximately 40% of patients showed evidence of healing. By the time of the Inca Empire between 1400 and 1500 CE, this figure had risen to between 75 and 83%. Some studies suggest that in certain regions and time periods, survival rates may have reached as high as 90%. To put this in perspective, when European surgeons began performing cranial surgery in the 19th century, with access to metal instruments and at least some understanding of anatomy, their patients often fared worse. Infection was rampant and mortality rates were high. The success of ancient Peruvian surgeons raises important questions about their techniques and knowledge. What tools did these ancient surgeons use? In Peru, obsidian, a volcanic glass that can be worked to create edges sharper than modern steel scalpels, was the primary material. Archaeologists have found obsidian blades at burial sites alongside trepanned skulls. The surgeons also used Tumi's distinctive ceremonial knives with semicircular blades. For the scraping method, they likely employed sharp-edged stones or shells, gradually wearing away the bone in controlled circular motions. The procedures would have required considerable skill and anatomical knowledge. The human skull varies in thickness across its surface, from about 6 millimeters in some areas to over 10 millimeters in others. Beneath the bone lie the meninges' protective membranes covering the brain, and a network of blood vessels. Cutting too deeply would cause fatal bleeding or brain damage. The ancient surgeons somehow learned to recognize when they were approaching the inner table of the skull, stopping before they penetrated too far. But why perform such a dangerous procedure? The answer likely varied across cultures and time periods. In some cases, the medical indication seems clear. Several trepanned skulls show evidence of head trauma fractures or depressed bone fragments that would have caused pressure on the brain. Trepanation in these cases may have been a treatment for what we now call epidural or subdural hematomas, bleeding between the skull and brain that creates dangerous pressure. By removing a section of bone, the surgeon could relieve this pressure and potentially save the patient's life. Other trepanned skulls show no signs of injury, suggesting different motivations. Ancient texts and ethnographic evidence from cultures that practiced trepanation into more recent times provide some clues. The procedure may have been used to treat chronic headaches, epilepsy, or mental illness. In many traditional belief systems, these conditions were attributed to supernatural causes, evil spirits or demons that had entered the body. The opening in the skull was thought to provide an escape route for these malevolent forces. The Greek physician Hippocrates, writing in the 5th century BUE, described trepanation as a treatment for head injuries, and his texts provide detailed instructions for the procedure. He advised surgeons to avoid cutting near the temples where major blood vessels lie close to the surface, and to work carefully to avoid damaging the brain. This suggests that by the classical period, Mediterranean physicians had developed a relatively sophisticated understanding of cranial anatomy, likely built on centuries of earlier experience. In medieval Europe, trepanation continued to be practiced, though often with mixed results. Medical texts from this period describe the procedure as a treatment for skull fractures, but also for conditions like melancholy and madness. The survival rates appear to have been lower than in ancient Peru, possibly due to differences in technique tools or post-operative care. The question of post-operative care is particularly intriguing. How did ancient patients survive the risk of infection without antibiotics? Some researchers suggest that the high-altitude environment of the Peruvian Andes, with its thin, dry air, may have provided a naturally more sterile environment. Others point to possible use of plant-based medicines with antimicrobial properties. The Incas and their predecessors had extensive knowledge of medicinal plants, and some of these may have been applied to surgical wounds. Recent experimental archaeology has provided additional insights. Researchers have attempted to replicate ancient trepanation techniques using period-appropriate tools. These experiments have demonstrated that with practice it's possible to create a cranial opening using stone tools in approximately 30 to 40 minutes, a surprisingly short time. The scraping method, while slower, offers better control and may have been safer as it's easier to judge depth when gradually abrading the bone rather than cutting through it. The practice of trepanation didn't end with ancient civilizations. It persisted in some cultures, well into the modern era. In parts of Africa, traditional healers performed trepanation into the 20th century. In Europe, the procedure evolved into more refined forms of cranial surgery, though it wasn't until the development of antiseptic techniques in the late 19th century that survival rates began to consistently improve. What does the long history of trepanation reveal about the development of medicine? First, it demonstrates that surgical innovation is not a modern phenomenon. Ancient peoples were capable of developing sophisticated techniques through observation, experimentation, and accumulated knowledge passed down through generations. The improving survival rates in Peru over time suggest a process of refinement. Surgeons learning from experience, identifying what worked and what didn't, and gradually perfecting their methods. Second, trepanation reminds us that medical progress doesn't always follow a straight line forward. The ancient Peruvian surgeons achieved survival rates that wouldn't be matched in Europe until the late 19th century, despite the latter's more advanced tools and theoretical knowledge. Sometimes practical skill and careful technique matter more than technological sophistication. Third, these ancient skulls, with their carefully crafted openings, speak to a fundamental human impulse, the desire to heal, to intervene when someone is suffering, even at great risk. The surgeons who performed these procedures were taking enormous chances working without the safety net of modern medicine. Yet they persisted, driven by the hope that they could help. The trepanned skulls that archaeologists continue to discover remind us that the history of medicine extends far deeper into the past than we sometimes imagine. These weren't crude experiments by primitive peoples, but carefully executed procedures performed by skilled practitioners who understood in their own way the delicate architecture of the human skull and the risks involved in breaching it. Their legacy is preserved in bone in the smooth healed edges of openings that allowed their patients to live on carrying these marks of ancient surgery for the rest of their lives. Blood, the mysterious liquid, and the art of bloodletting. We've seen how ancient surgeons dared to open the skull. Now let's examine a practice that dominated Western medicine for even longer one, based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how the human body works. On the morning of December 14, 1799, George Washington woke at his Mount Vernon estate with a severe sore throat. The 67-year-old former president had been caught in freezing rain the previous day while inspecting his farms. By dawn, he was struggling to breathe and could barely speak. His physicians were summoned. What followed would be a textbook example of 18th century medical practice and a demonstration of how a treatment meant to heal could hasten death. Washington's doctors did what any well-trained physician of that era would do. They began removing his blood. Over the course of about 12 hours, they drained approximately half a gallon, roughly 40% of his total blood volume. Between the bloodletting sessions, they applied blistering agents to his throat and gave him purgatives to induce vomiting and diarrhea. Washington died that evening. While we cannot know with certainty whether he would have survived with different treatment, medical historians generally agree that the aggressive bloodletting significantly weakened him and likely contributed to his death. The practice that killed Washington had ancient roots. Bloodletting, or phlebotomy, was based on a theory of health that had dominated Western medicine since the time of ancient Greece. To understand why intelligent, educated physicians believed that draining blood could cure disease, we need to examine the theoretical framework that supported this practice for more than 2,000 years. The foundation was laid by Hippocrates of Kos, who lived in the 5th century BCE and is often called the father of Western medicine. Hippocrates proposed that the human body contained 4 fundamental fluids, or humors: blood phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each humor was associated with specific qualities. Blood was hot and moist. Phlegm was cold and moist. Yellow bile was hot and dry, and black bile was cold and dry. Health, according to this theory, depended on maintaining the proper balance among these 4 humors. This wasn't an arbitrary system. It was part of a broader philosophical framework that connected the human body to the natural world. The 4 humors corresponded to the 4 elements: earth, air, fire, and water, and to the 4 seasons. It was an elegant theory that seemed to explain many observations about health and disease. When someone had a fever, they appeared hot and flushed, suggesting an excess of hot, moist blood. When someone had a cold, they produced excess phlegm. The theory provided a coherent explanation for symptoms and crucially suggested clear treatments: restore balance by removing the excess humor. The Roman physician Galen, who lived in the 2nd century CE, expanded and systematized humoral theory. His writings would dominate European medicine for more than 1,000 years. Galen was a careful observer and a skilled anatomist. He dissected animals and treated wounded gladiators, gaining extensive knowledge of anatomy and physiology. His authority was immense, and his endorsement of bloodletting gave the practice unassailable credibility. According to Galenic medicine, blood was the most abundant humor, and the one most likely to become excessive. Nearly any ailment from headaches to pneumonia, from mental illness to broken bones, could be attributed to an excess of blood. The treatment was straightforward: remove the excess blood to restore balance. The methods varied. The most common approach was venesection, cutting into a vein, usually in the arm, and allowing blood to flow into a bowl. Physicians developed elaborate charts showing which veins should be opened for which conditions. For a headache, blood might be drawn from the temple. For liver problems, from the right arm. The amount removed varied depending on the patient's condition, age, and constitution, but quantities of 1 to 2 pints were common. Another method employed leeches, small aquatic worms that attach to skin and feed on blood. Leeches offered certain advantages. They could be applied to areas where venesection was difficult, and they injected an anticoagulant that kept blood flowing even after they were removed. In the early 19th century, leech therapy became so popular in Europe that the medicinal leech was nearly harvested to extinction. France alone imported more than 40 million leeches annually during the 1830s. A third method, called cupping, involved creating suction on the skin using heated glass cups. Sometimes the skin was scarified, scratched, or cut before the cups were applied, allowing blood to be drawn out. Dry cupping without cutting was thought to draw excess humors to the surface without actually removing blood. Let's consider how widespread this practice became. By the 18th and 19th centuries, bloodletting had reached its peak of popularity in Europe and America. It was the default treatment for an extraordinary range of conditions. Medical textbooks of the era recommended bloodletting for fever inflammation, apoplexy, stroke, pneumonia, pleurisy, and countless other ailments. Benjamin Rush, one of the signers of the American Declaration of Independence and a prominent Philadelphia physician, was an enthusiastic advocate. During the yellow fever epidemic that struck Philadelphia in 1793, Rush prescribed aggressive bloodletting, sometimes removing up to 80% of a patient's blood volume over the course of treatment. The practice was so routine that many people performed it on themselves, or had it done by barbers, the origin of the barber's pole, with its red and white stripes representing blood and bandages. Bloodletting was considered preventive medicine, as well as treatment. Some people had themselves bled seasonally, believing it promoted health. What makes this particularly striking is that bloodletting often made patients worse, not better. A person with pneumonia or severe infection needs their full blood volume to support their immune system and maintain blood pressure. Removing large quantities of blood induces shock, reduces oxygen delivery to tissues, and impairs the body's ability to fight disease. Yet physicians interpreted the weakness and pallor that followed bloodletting as signs that the treatment was working. The excess plethora of blood had been reduced. There were dissenters. Some physicians questioned whether bloodletting was truly effective. In the 16th century, the French surgeon Ambroise Paré expressed doubts about excessive bleeding. In the early 19th century, a French physician named Pierre Louis conducted one of the first statistical studies in medicine, comparing outcomes in pneumonia, patients who received bloodletting with those who did not. His 1835 study found no benefit from the practice. But such evidence-based challenges were slow to overcome centuries of tradition and theoretical conviction. The decline of bloodletting came gradually as medicine began to shift toward empirical observation and scientific experimentation. The development of the microscope allowed researchers to study blood and understand its actual composition and function. In 1628, William Harvey had demonstrated that blood circulates through the body, pumped by the heart, a discovery that fundamentally challenged galenic physiology, though it took time for the implications to be fully absorbed. By the mid-19th century, as germ theory emerged and physicians began to understand disease in terms of specific pathogens rather than humoral imbalances, bloodletting finally began to fall out of favor. The transition wasn't immediate or complete. Some physicians continued to practice bloodletting into the early 20th century, particularly in rural areas. But by 1900, it had largely been abandoned in mainstream medicine, recognized as ineffective and often harmful. Interestingly, bloodletting has not disappeared entirely from modern medicine. Today, therapeutic phlebotomy is used to treat specific conditions where it provides genuine benefit. Patients with hemochromatosis, a genetic disorder causing iron overload, require regular blood removal to prevent organ damage. Polycythemia vera A condition, where the body produces too many red blood cells, is also treated with phlebotomy. And leeches have made a comeback in microsurgery, where their anticoagulant saliva helps maintain blood flow in reattached fingers or reconstructed tissue. But these modern applications are based on understanding the specific mechanisms involved, a far cry from the theoretical humoral imbalances that justified bloodletting for 2 millennia. What does the long history of bloodletting reveal about medical practice and human nature? First, it demonstrates how a compelling theoretical framework can sustain a practice despite contradictory evidence. Humoral theory was logical and comprehensive. It explained symptoms, suggested treatments, and fit within the broader philosophical understanding of the natural world. For physicians trained in this system, bloodletting made perfect sense. The theory was so deeply embedded that it shaped how doctors interpreted what they observed. When patients weakened after bloodletting, this was seen as confirmation that the treatment was working, not as evidence of harm. Second, bloodletting illustrates the danger of relying on authority rather than evidence. Galen's writings were treated as nearly infallible for more than 1,000 years. To question bloodletting was to question Galen, which few physicians were willing to do. Medical education consisted largely of studying ancient texts rather than observing patients and testing treatments. It wasn't until medicine began to embrace empirical investigation that practices like bloodletting could be properly evaluated. Third, this history reminds us of the human cost of medical error. We cannot know how many people died from bloodletting rather than from their underlying diseases, but the number was certainly substantial. George Washington is perhaps the most famous victim, but countless others, rich and poor, famous and unknown, were weakened or killed by a treatment their doctors believed would help them. The story of bloodletting is a sobering reminder that good intentions and sincere belief are not enough. Medical practice must be grounded in evidence, tested through careful observation, and revised when shown to be ineffective or harmful. The physicians who bled George Washington were not cruel or incompetent. They were following the best medical knowledge of their time. But that knowledge was wrong, built on a foundation of theory rather than empirical testing. It would take centuries of accumulated doubt, careful observation, and eventually scientific investigation to overturn a practice that had seemed self-evidently correct to generations of healers. Radium, the miraculous light-turned disaster. We've examined how ancient theories could sustain harmful practices for centuries. Now let's turn to a more modern tragedy, one driven not by ancient philosophy, but by the excitement surrounding a genuine scientific discovery. In December 1898, Marie and Pierre Curie announced the discovery of a new element. They had isolated it from tons of uranium ore, working in a converted shed in Paris under conditions that were by any standard primitive. The element glowed with an eerie blue-green light in the darkness. They named it radium from the Latin word for ray. Marie Curie would later recall that the glowing tubes of radium salt in their laboratory looked like faint fairy lights. It was a poetic description of something that would, within a few decades, be recognized as profoundly dangerous. The discovery of radium captured the public imagination in a way that few scientific findings have before or since. Here was an element that seemed to defy the laws of nature. It produced energy continuously without any apparent fuel source, and it glowed in the dark. In an era fascinated by electricity, X-rays, and other invisible forces, radium seemed almost magical. The Curie's research showed that radium emitted powerful radiation that could penetrate matter, affect photographic plates, and cause certain substances to fluoresce. Within a few years, researchers discovered that radium could destroy diseased tissue, leading to its use in treating cancer. This legitimate medical application would help establish radium's reputation as a healing substance. But the enthusiasm for radium quickly expanded far beyond careful medical use. By the early 1900s, entrepreneurs and manufacturers had begun adding radium to an astonishing array of products. The reasoning seemed straightforward. If radium could destroy cancer cells, surely its energy could invigorate healthy tissue as well. This logic, though fundamentally flawed, would drive a radium craze that lasted for more than 2 decades. Let's consider the range of radium products that became available. There was Radithor, a patent medicine consisting of distilled water containing radium. The manufacturer Bailey Radium Laboratories claimed it could treat more than 150 conditions from high blood pressure to impotence. Each small bottle contained approximately 1 microcurie of radium, a tiny amount by some measures, but significant when consumed regularly over time. The product was expensive, selling for about $1 per bottle in the 1920s, which would be roughly $15 today. Cosmetics companies added radium to face creams and beauty products, promising that the element's energy would rejuvenate skin and reduce wrinkles. Thoradia, a French brand, marketed radium-laced powder and cream. The advertisements featured elegant women and emphasized the scientific basis of the products. In Germany, a company called Doramod produced toothpaste containing thorium, a radioactive element similar to radium, claiming it would make teeth shine and kill bacteria. Radium was added to chocolate bars sold as an energy supplement. It was incorporated into suppositories, bath salts, and even contraceptive jellies. Spas offered radium water treatments where patrons could drink water that had been exposed to radium or bathe in radium-laced pools. The town of Jakimov, in what is now the Czech Republic, became famous for its radium spa, attracting wealthy visitors from across Europe. In the United States, similar establishments opened offering radium treatments for arthritis, gout, and various other ailments. Perhaps no case better illustrates the dangers of radium than the story of Eben Byers. Byers was a wealthy American industrialist and amateur golf champion. In 1927, at age 47, he injured his arm. A doctor suggested he try Radithor, and Byers became convinced of its benefits. He began drinking 2 to 3 bottles daily, sometimes more. He continued this regimen for nearly 4 years, consuming an estimated 1,400 bottles in total. Initially, Byers reported feeling better. He attributed increased energy and vitality to the radium water. He recommended it to friends and business associates. But by 1930, his health began to deteriorate. He lost weight and developed persistent pain in his jaw. His teeth began falling out. In 1931, doctors discovered that his jawbone was disintegrating. The radium had accumulated in his bones, where it continued to emit radiation, destroying tissue from within. Byers died on March 31, 1932. An autopsy revealed extensive damage throughout his body. His skull had holes in it where bone had simply disappeared. His jaw had largely disintegrated. The radium had destroyed his bone marrow and damaged his internal organs. The Wall Street Journal ran a headline that captured the horror. The radium water worked fine until his jaw came off. Byers' body was so radioactive that when it was exhumed in 1965 for study, it still emitted measurable radiation. The Byers case attracted significant media attention and helped turn public opinion against radium products. But it was not an isolated incident. Researchers have documented numerous cases of radium poisoning from consumer products. The exact number of victims will never be known, as many cases likely went undiagnosed or were attributed to other causes. Moving forward to the medical profession's role in this tragedy, we find that many physicians actively promoted radium products. Medical journals carried advertisements for radium water and radium devices. Some doctors genuinely believed in radium's therapeutic properties based on its proven effectiveness against certain cancers. Others may have been motivated by financial incentives. Some radium product manufacturers paid doctors to recommend their products. The scientific community's response to the radium craze was mixed. Some researchers raised early concerns about radiation safety. As early as 1902, Pierre Curie had noted that radium could cause burns and tissue damage. Marie Curie herself suffered from radiation-related health problems throughout her life, though the connection wasn't fully understood at the time. By the 1920s, evidence of radiation's harmful effects was accumulating. Studies of early radiologists showed increased rates of cancer and other health problems. Yet this evidence was slow to influence public perception or regulatory action. What makes the radium story particularly significant is that it unfolded during a period when scientific understanding of radiation was actively developing. Unlike bloodletting, which persisted due to adherence to ancient theory, the radium craze occurred despite emerging evidence of harm. The enthusiasm for this new technology, combined with commercial interests and inadequate regulation, allowed dangerous products to remain on the market for years after their risks should have been apparent. The regulatory response came gradually. In 1932, following Byers' death and growing evidence of harm, the Federal Trade Commission began taking action against radium product manufacturers. Radithor was removed from the market. Other radium products followed, though some remained available into the 1940s. The Food and Drug Administration, which gained increased authority over drug safety through the 1938 Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, eventually banned most radioactive consumer products. The story of radium in consumer products would intersect with another tragedy, that of the Radium Girls, young women who painted luminous watch dials and suffered terrible consequences. Their story would further expose the dangers of radium and lead to important changes in workplace safety law. But that is a story that deserves its own careful examination. What does the radium craze reveal about the relationship between scientific discovery, commercial exploitation, and public safety? First, it demonstrates how genuine scientific achievement can be distorted by commercial interests. The Curie's discovery of radium was a legitimate breakthrough that advanced our understanding of atomic physics and led to important medical applications. But this legitimate science was used to market products that had no scientific basis and caused real harm. Second, the radium story shows how the prestige of science can be exploited to sell products. Radium manufacturers emphasize the scientific credentials of their products using technical language and citing research, often selectively or misleadingly. Consumers trusted these claims, assuming that products marketed as scientific must be safe and effective. This pattern would repeat itself many times throughout the 20th century with other products and technologies. Third, this episode highlights the importance of regulatory oversight. In the early 20th century, there were few regulations governing what could be sold as medicine or added to consumer products. Manufacturers could make sweeping health claims with little evidence. The radium craze helped demonstrate the need for stronger consumer protection laws and independent testing of products before they reached the market. Finally, The radium story reminds us that even well-intentioned enthusiasm for new technology must be tempered with caution and rigorous safety testing. The people who bought radium products weren't foolish. They were responding to what seemed like credible scientific evidence endorsed by doctors and backed by the prestige of a Nobel Prize-winning discovery. But the long-term effects of chronic low-level radiation exposure weren't yet understood, and by the time the dangers became clear, many people had already been harmed. The legacy of the radium craze extends beyond the individual victims. It contributed to the development of radiation and safety standards, influenced drug regulation, and provided cautionary lessons about the commercialization of scientific discoveries. Today, the use of radioactive materials is strictly controlled, and products containing radium are found only in museums and hazardous waste sites. But the fundamental tension between scientific progress, commercial opportunity, and public safety remains relevant. Each new technology, from pharmaceuticals to artificial intelligence, raises similar questions about how to balance innovation with precaution and how to protect people from harm while allowing beneficial developments to proceed. Radium Girls. When workers became experiments. While wealthy consumers like Eben buyers were drinking radium water by choice, another group was being exposed to far higher levels of radiation, not as patients or customers, but as workers. In April 1917, the United States Radium Corporation opened a factory in Orange, New Jersey. The timing was significant. America had just entered World War I, and there was high demand for luminous watch dials that soldiers could read in the dark trenches. The company hired young women, mostly teenagers, and women in their early 20s to paint radium-based luminous paint onto watch dials, instrument panels, and military equipment. The work was considered desirable. It paid well more than 3 times what a factory worker or store clerk might earn. The studio where the women worked was clean and bright, unlike many industrial workplaces of that era. The women were called ghost girls because the radium dust made their clothes, hair, and skin glow in the dark. The paint they used was called undark. It contained radium mixed with zinc sulfide and a glue-like substance. The radium caused the zinc sulfide to fluoresce, creating a greenish glow that would last for years. Each watch dial required painstaking precision. The numbers had to be small and perfectly formed. To achieve this, the women were instructed to use a technique called lip pointing. They would put the brush in their mouth, use their lips to bring the bristles to a fine point, dip it in the radium paint, and then carefully paint the numbers. Each time they pointed the brush with their lips, they ingested a small amount of radium. The company's management knew about the technique. In fact, supervisors taught it to new workers and encouraged it as the best way to maintain precision. When some women expressed concern about putting the brushes in their mouths, they were told that the radium was harmless, no more dangerous than table salt. Company literature described radium as beneficial to health. After all, radium was being sold as a health tonic and used in medical treatments. Why would it be dangerous? What the workers weren't told was that the company's own chemists and researchers took extensive precautions when handling radium. They used lead screens, tongs, and protective equipment. They never touched the radium directly or allowed it near their mouths. The president of the company, Dr. Sabin von Sochocki, who had invented the luminous paint, was well aware of radium's dangers. But this knowledge was not shared with the dial painters. The women painted hundreds of dials each day. A fast worker might paint 250 dials in a single shift. Each time she pointed her brush, she ingested radium. The element accumulated in their bodies, particularly in their bones where calcium is stored. Radium, being chemically similar to calcium, was absorbed into the bone structure. There it remained, continuously emitting radiation that damaged surrounding tissue. Let's consider what began to happen in the early 1920s. The first dial painter known to have died from radium poisoning was Molly Maggia. She had started working at the factory in 1917 when she was 15 years old. By 1921, she began experiencing dental problems, toothaches, and loose teeth. Her dentist removed several teeth, but the sockets failed to heal. Her jaw became swollen and painful. In 1922, her entire lower jaw was removed in an attempt to stop the spread of what doctors thought was an infection. The surgery didn't help. Molly died in September 1922 at age 24. The death certificate listed the cause as ulcerative stomatitis, inflammation of the mouth. No mention was made of radium. But Molly was not alone. Other dial painters began developing similar symptoms. Their teeth fell out. Their jaws developed painful abscesses. Some developed anemia. Others suffered spontaneous fractures, their bones breaking with minimal trauma because the radiation had made them brittle. Several women developed tumors. The company's response was to deny any connection between the work and these illnesses. When workers or their families asked questions, company officials suggested the women were suffering from syphilis or other diseases unrelated to their employment. Dr. Harrison Martland, a medical examiner in Newark, became interested in these cases. In 1925, he began conducting tests on the living and deceased dial painters. He used an electroscope, a device that detects radiation, and found that the women's bodies were radioactive. Their breath, their bones, even their tissue samples emitted measurable radiation. Martland published his findings, coining the term radium jaw to describe the characteristic deterioration of the jawbone seen in these cases. His research established definitively that the dial painters were suffering from radium poisoning. Armed with this evidence, 5 former dial painters decided to sue the United States Radium Corporation. Their names were Grace Fryer, Edna Hussman, Catherine Schaub, Quinta MacDonald, and Albina Larice. They became known as the Radium Girls. Filing the lawsuit was itself a challenge. Grace Fryer spent 2 years trying to find a lawyer willing to take the case. Most attorneys were reluctant to sue such a powerful corporation. When she finally found representation, the legal battle proved long and difficult. The women faced multiple obstacles. New Jersey law at the time required that occupational disease lawsuits be filed within 2 years of exposure. Since the women had left the factory years earlier, the company argued that the statute of limitations had expired. The women's lawyers countered that the harm from radium exposure wasn't immediately apparent, that the statute of limitations should begin when the disease manifested, not when exposure occurred. This was a novel legal argument at the time. The trial was scheduled for January 1928. By then, all 5 women were seriously ill. Grace Fryer's spine had deteriorated to the point where she wore a back brace. Quinta MacDonald's jaw had been removed. They were too weak to raise their hands to take the oath, so they were sworn in while lying on stretchers in the courtroom. The sight of these young women visibly dying brought national attention to the case. Newspapers across the country covered the trial. Public sympathy was overwhelmingly with the women. Before the case went to a jury, the company agreed to settle. Each woman received 10,000 EQUIVALE NIDHNTO1YOUG HLY $10,000 equivalent to roughly 750 euros today, plus a $600 annual pension and coverage of medical expenses. It was far less than they had sought, but the women were too ill to endure a prolonged trial. The settlement was reached in June 1928. Within a few years, all 5 women had died. Grace Fryer died in 1933 at age 34. The others passed away between 1929 and 1933, all in their 20s or early 30s. The legal victory, though limited in its financial compensation, had broader significance. The case established important precedents. It affirmed that employers have a responsibility to protect workers from occupational hazards. It established that companies could be held liable for illnesses that didn't manifest until years after exposure. And it demonstrated that workers had the right to accurate information about the materials they handled. The impact extended beyond legal precedent. The publicity surrounding the Radium Girls case contributed to growing awareness of radiation hazards. It influenced the development of occupational safety standards and workplace health regulations. The case helped establish the field of industrial hygiene and led to improved safety practices in industries handling radioactive materials. Research on the Radium Girls continued long after their deaths. In 1965, scientists from the Argonne National Laboratory began a study of radium dial painters, both living and deceased. They exhumed the bodies of several deceased workers, including some of the original Radium Girls. The remains were still highly radioactive more than 30 years after death. The radiation had caused extensive bone damage, visible even in skeletal remains. This research contributed to our understanding of how radiation affects the human body over time and helped establish safety standards for radiation exposure. The story of the Radium Girls raises profound questions about the relationship between workers and employers, between profit and safety, between what is known and what is disclosed. The United States Radium Corporation's management knew, or should have known, that radium was dangerous. Their own chemists took precautions, yet they told young workers that the material was harmless and instructed them to put radium-laden brushes in their mouths dozens of times each day. This wasn't mere ignorance, it was a deliberate decision to prioritize production and profit over worker safety. The case also reveals how vulnerable workers can be, particularly young women, in an era when labor protections were minimal. These women trusted their employers. They believed what they were told about safety. They had no independent way to verify the information they received. When they became ill, they faced a legal system that made it difficult to hold corporations accountable. That they succeeded in their lawsuit despite these obstacles is testament to their courage and determination. The legacy of the Radium Girls extends to the present day. The workplace safety regulations we now take for granted requirements for protective equipment limits on exposure to hazardous materials, workers' right to know about workplace dangers, employers' liability for occupational diseases, all have roots in cases like this one. The Radium Girls didn't just win compensation for themselves, they helped establish principles that protect workers today. Their story also serves as a reminder that technological progress and scientific discovery must be accompanied by careful attention to safety and ethics. Radium was a genuine scientific breakthrough with legitimate applications. But the rush to commercialize this discovery, combined with inadequate regulation and corporate indifference to worker safety, led to tragedy. The young women who painted watch dials paid with their health and their lives for society's failure to balance innovation with protection. Today, when researchers study the effects of radiation exposure, they still reference data from the Radium Girls. When safety standards for radioactive materials are established, the experiences of these women inform those decisions. Their suffering contributed to knowledge that has helped protect countless others. It's a legacy they never sought, but bought at a price no one should have to pay. Lobotomy. Brain surgery to cure mental illness. The Radium Girls fought for recognition that their workplace was harming them. But some medical interventions were performed with the full consent of families desperate for help, interventions that would later be recognized as deeply harmful. On November 12, 1935, a Portuguese neurologist named Antonio Egas Moniz performed an operation that would change the course of psychiatric treatment for the next 2 decades. The patient was a 63-year-old woman suffering from severe anxiety and paranoia. Moniz, working with neurosurgeon Almeida Lima, drilled 2 holes in her skull and injected ethanol into her frontal lobes, destroying tissue that connected the frontal cortex to other parts of the brain. The procedure was based on Moniz's theory that mental illness resulted from fixed patterns of thought neural pathways that had become stuck in destructive loops. By severing these connections, he believed patients could be freed from their symptoms. The woman survived the operation. Moniz reported that her anxiety decreased, though she also became somewhat apathetic. Encouraged by this result, he performed the procedure on 19 more patients over the following months, refining his technique. Instead of alcohol injection, he began using a surgical instrument called a leucotomy, a wire loop that could be inserted into the brain and rotated to cut tissue. He called the procedure a prefrontal leucotomy. In 1936, he published his findings, claiming success in approximately 1/3 of cases, improvement in another third, and no change in the remainder. These results, though mixed, attracted international attention. The context is important here. In the 1930s, psychiatric hospitals were overwhelmed with patients for whom there were few effective treatments. Schizophrenia, severe depression, and other serious mental illnesses often meant lifelong institutionalization. Patients lived in crowded wards, sometimes restrained or sedated. Families watched their loved ones deteriorate with no hope of recovery. In this environment, any treatment that offered even a possibility of improvement was welcomed despite significant risks. Moniz's work caught the attention of Walter Freeman, a neurologist at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. Freeman was 41 years old, ambitious and deeply concerned about the state of psychiatric care in America. In 1936, he and neurosurgeon James Watts performed the first prefrontal lobotomy in the United States. The patient was a 63-year-old woman from Kansas, suffering from agitation and insomnia. Freeman and Watts opened her skull and cut connections in her frontal lobes. She reportedly became calmer, though also less animated. Over the next several years, Freeman and Watts refined the procedure and performed it on dozens of patients. Freeman kept meticulous records photographing patients before and after surgery, documenting their symptoms and outcomes. He published papers and gave lectures promoting lobotomy as a treatment for severe mental illness. The procedure gained acceptance, particularly as Freeman reported success rates that seemed promising, though his criteria for success were often simply that patients became more manageable, even if they also lost initiative, creativity, and emotional depth. Let's consider what happened in 1946. Freeman, frustrated by the complexity and expense of traditional lobotomy, which required a neurosurgeon, an operating room, and general anesthesia, developed a new technique. He called it transorbital lobotomy. The procedure was startlingly simple. The patient was sedated with electroshock. Freeman then inserted a thin surgical instrument, similar to an ice pick, through the thin bone of the eye socket, just above the eyeball. He tapped it through the bone with a small hammer, then swept it back and forth to sever connections in the frontal lobe. The entire procedure took about 10 minutes. It could be performed in an office setting. Freeman's first transorbital lobotomy was performed in January 1946. The patient was a 29-year-old woman who had been hospitalized for mental illness. The procedure was done in Freeman's office. She recovered quickly and was discharged. Freeman was elated. He had developed a procedure that was fast, inexpensive, and didn't require a neurosurgeon. He began performing transorbital lobotomies regularly, sometimes several in a single day. James Watts, Freeman's surgical partner, was deeply troubled by this new technique. He felt it was too crude, too risky, and performed without adequate safeguards. The partnership between Freeman and Watts ended in 1950, with Watts refusing to participate in transorbital procedures. But Freeman continued undeterred. Between 1946 and his retirement, he performed approximately 3,500 lobotomies, many of them using the transorbital method. Freeman traveled extensively demonstrating his technique at state hospitals and psychiatric institutions across America. He drove a van he called his Lobotomobile, visiting hospitals in rural areas where psychiatric care was limited. He trained other doctors in the procedure. He performed lobotomies on patients as young as 4 years old. In one particularly disturbing demonstration, he performed lobotomies on 25 women in a single day at a West Virginia hospital, moving from patient to patient in assembly line fashion. The outcomes varied widely. Some patients did experience reduction in their most severe symptoms, violent behavior, extreme agitation, or debilitating anxiety. A few returned to relatively normal lives, but many others suffered serious complications. Some died from the procedure itself from bleeding or infection. Others survived, but were left profoundly changed. They became passive, emotionally flat, lacking in initiative or spontaneity. Some lost the ability to care for themselves. Families who had hoped for their loved one's recovery found themselves caring for someone who seemed diminished, as if an essential part of their personality had been removed along with the neural connections. One of the most well-known cases involved Rosemary Kennedy, sister of future President John F. Kennedy. Born in 1918, Rosemary had intellectual disabilities, and as she entered her 20s, became increasingly difficult for her family to manage. In 1941, when she was 23, her father Joseph Kennedy arranged for her to undergo a prefrontal lobotomy, performed by Freeman and Watts. The procedure left her incapacitated. She lost the ability to walk or speak coherently. She would spend the rest of her life in institutional care, never regaining the abilities she had before the surgery. The Kennedy family kept her condition private for decades. Moving forward to the question of how lobotomy became so widely accepted, we need to consider the institutional pressures of the time. State psychiatric hospitals were overcrowded and underfunded. Lobotomy offered a way to make patients more manageable, reducing the need for constant supervision. Hospital administrators, facing limited resources and overwhelming patient numbers, saw the procedure as a practical solution. Insurance companies and state governments appreciated the cost savings. A one-time surgical procedure was cheaper than years of hospitalization. The medical establishment's response was mixed. Some psychiatrists and neurologists embraced lobotomy enthusiastically. Others were skeptical or openly critical. But the critics faced challenges. There was little rigorous research on psychiatric treatments at the time. Controlled studies were rare. Much of the evidence for or against lobotomy was anecdotal. And Freeman was a skilled promoter, presenting his cases in the most favorable light and dismissing failures as inevitable in any medical procedure. In 1949, Antonio Egas Moniz was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for developing the lobotomy procedure. The Nobel Committee's citation praised his discovery of the therapeutic value of leucotomy in certain psychoses. This award gave the procedure additional credibility and prestige. It seemed to validate lobotomy as a legitimate medical treatment, despite growing concerns about its effects. The decline of lobotomy came relatively quickly once it began. In the early 1950s, new medications for treating mental illness became available. Chlorpromazine, introduced in 1952 and marketed as Thorazine, was the first effective antipsychotic drug. It could reduce symptoms of schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders without surgery. Other psychiatric medications followed. These drugs were not perfect. They had significant side effects, but they offered an alternative to irreversible brain surgery. As medications became available, the number of lobotomies performed began to decline. Medical opinion shifted. Studies examining long-term outcomes of lobotomy patients revealed high rates of serious complications and poor quality of life. By the 1960s, lobotomy was falling out of favor. By the 1970s, it was rarely performed. Freeman performed his last lobotomy in 1967. The patient, one of his former successes, whom he was operating on for a third time, died from a brain hemorrhage. Freeman's medical license was revoked shortly afterward. Today, lobotomy is widely regarded as one of the darkest chapters in the history of medicine. The procedure is no longer performed except in extremely rare cases where very limited, precisely targeted brain surgery might be used to treat otherwise untreatable conditions, and even then only with extensive ethical oversight and informed consent. What does the history of lobotomy reveal about medical practice and human vulnerability? First, it demonstrates how desperation can override caution. Families facing the anguish of a loved one's severe mental illness were willing to try almost anything that offered hope. Doctors confronting conditions they couldn't effectively treat embraced a procedure that seemed to offer results, even when those results were often problematic. Second, the lobotomy story shows how institutional pressures can shape medical practice. The procedure became popular not primarily because it helped patients, but because it made them easier to manage and reduced costs for overcrowded institutions. The interests of patients became secondary to administrative convenience. Third, this history raises questions about informed consent and medical ethics. Many lobotomy patients could not consent for themselves due to their mental state. Families made decisions on their behalf often without fully understanding the risks or the likelihood that their loved one would be permanently changed. Freeman and others performing lobotomies sometimes minimized risks and exaggerated benefits, making truly informed consent impossible. Finally, the fact that Moniz received a Nobel Prize for developing lobotomy reminds us that even the most prestigious recognition doesn't guarantee that a medical procedure is safe or effective. Scientific consensus can be wrong. Awards can be given prematurely before long-term consequences are understood. The Nobel Committee has never revoked Moniz's prize, though some have called for it to be rescinded. The legacy of lobotomy extends beyond the thousands of individuals who underwent the procedure. It contributed to reforms in psychiatric care, to the development of patients' rights movements, and to more rigorous standards for evaluating surgical procedures. It serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of prioritizing symptom management over patient well-being and about what can happen when medical innovation proceeds without adequate ethical constraints. Walter Freeman, doctor or fanatic. We've examined lobotomy as a procedure. Now let's look more closely at the man who became its most prolific practitioner, a figure whose legacy remains deeply contested. Walter Jackson Freeman II was born on November 14, 1895, into a prominent medical family in Philadelphia. His grandfather, William Keene, was one of America's most distinguished surgeons. Freeman grew up surrounded by medical achievement, but an expectation. He graduated from Yale University in 1916 and received his medical degree from the University of Pennsylvania in 1920. He specialized in neurology, studying in Europe before returning to the United States to establish his practice. By his early 30s, he was chairman of the neurology department at George Washington University, a position of considerable prestige. Freeman was by all accounts brilliant and energetic. He was also driven by what colleagues described as an obsession with finding effective treatments for mental illness. In the 1930s, this was perhaps the most frustrating area of medicine. Psychiatric hospitals housed hundreds of thousands of patients with conditions that doctors could neither cure nor effectively manage. Patients with schizophrenia, severe depression, or other serious mental illnesses often spent decades in institutions. Some were restrained. Many were simply warehoused in overcrowded wards with minimal care. Freeman visited these hospitals and was deeply affected by what he saw. When Antonio Egas Moniz published his findings on prefrontal leucotomy in 1936, Freeman saw what he believed was a breakthrough. Here was a procedure that seemed to offer hope where none had existed. Freeman contacted neurosurgeon James Watts, and together they performed their first lobotomy in September 1936. The patient showed some improvement, becoming less agitated. Freeman was encouraged. Over the next decade, Freeman and Watts performed hundreds of lobotomies. Freeman kept detailed records photographing patients before and after surgery, documenting their symptoms and progress. He published papers and gave lectures. He was an effective communicator, able to present complex medical information in accessible terms. He genuinely believed he was helping people, offering treatment to those who had been written off as hopeless cases. But there was a troubling pattern in Freeman's work. His definition of success was often simply that patients became calmer and more manageable. He would photograph patients before surgery looking distressed or agitated, then photograph them afterward looking placid and cooperative. He presented these as evidence of improvement. What he didn't emphasize was that many of these patients had also lost something essential: their initiative, their emotional range, their ability to function independently. They were easier to manage, but at the cost of their full humanity. Let's consider what happened in 1946 when Freeman developed the transorbital lobotomy technique. His motivation was practical. Traditional lobotomy required a neurosurgeon, an operating room, general anesthesia, and significant recovery time. It was expensive and time-consuming. Freeman wanted a procedure that could be performed quickly and cheaply, making it accessible to the thousands of patients in state hospitals who would never have access to conventional surgery. The transorbital method was startlingly simple. Freeman would sedate the patient with electroshock, rendering them unconscious for a few minutes. He would then insert a thin instrument similar to an ice pick through the eye socket, tapping it through the thin bone with a small mallet. Once inside the skull, he would sweep the instrument back and forth, severing connections in the frontal lobe. The entire procedure took about 10 minutes. There was minimal bleeding, no need for an operating room, and patients could often go home the same day. James Watts was horrified by this new technique. He felt it was too crude, too risky, and performed without adequate safeguards. The partnership between Freeman and Watts, which had lasted 14 years, ended in 1950. Watts refused to participate in transorbital procedures and eventually stopped working with Freeman entirely. But Freeman continued, convinced that he had developed a procedure that could help thousands of people who would otherwise have no treatment options. Freeman began traveling extensively, demonstrating his technique at state hospitals across the country. He drove a van that he called his Lobotomobile, visiting institutions in rural areas where psychiatric care was minimal. He would arrive at a hospital set up in a conference room or office and perform multiple procedures in a single day. At one West Virginia hospital in 1952, he performed 25 lobotomies in a single day, moving from patient to patient in assembly line fashion. He trained other doctors in the technique, spreading the practice across the country. Freeman's patients ranged widely in age and diagnosis. He performed lobotomies on children as young as 4 years old. He operated on patients with schizophrenia, depression, anxiety disorders, and behavioral problems. Some were referred by psychiatrists who had exhausted other options. Others were sent by families desperate for help. Some were institutionalized patients selected by hospital administrators who saw lobotomy as a way to make overcrowded wards more manageable. The outcomes were highly variable. Freeman maintained detailed records on many of his patients, following up with them for years after surgery. Some, he reported, returned to relatively normal lives, holding jobs, maintaining relationships, functioning independently. Others showed modest improvement, less agitation, fewer symptoms. But many suffered serious complications or poor outcomes. Some died from the procedure itself. Others survived but were left severely impaired, unable to care for themselves, emotionally flat, lacking in initiative or spontaneity. One case that would ultimately end Freeman's career involved a woman named Helen Mortensen. She had been one of Freeman's early patients undergoing her first lobotomy in 1946. Freeman considered her a success story. She had improved enough to leave the hospital and live independently. But over the years, her symptoms returned. Freeman performed a second lobotomy in 1956. Again, she improved temporarily. In 1967, when her symptoms returned once more, Freeman performed a third lobotomy. During the procedure, Helen suffered a fatal brain hemorrhage. She died on the operating table. She was 56 years old. Helen's death attracted media attention and medical scrutiny. Freeman's medical license was revoked shortly afterward. He was 72 years old and had performed approximately 3,500 lobotomies over his career. He spent his remaining years traveling, visiting former patients, and defending his work. He maintained detailed correspondence with many of them, tracking their progress and collecting evidence of successful outcomes. He died in 1972 at age 76, still convinced that he had helped thousands of people who would otherwise have had no hope of improvement. Moving forward to how historians and medical ethicists view Freeman today, we find deeply divided opinions. Some see him as a well-intentioned physician, working within the limitations of his era, trying to help patients for whom no other treatments existed. They point out that psychiatric care in the 1940s and 1950s was often brutal. Patients were restrained, subjected to prolonged isolation, or given treatments like insulin shock therapy that were also dangerous and of questionable effectiveness. In this context, Freeman's belief that lobotomy offered a better alternative seems less unreasonable. Others view Freeman as a dangerous zealot who prioritized his own ambitions over patient welfare. They note that he was not a surgeon, yet he performed thousands of brain operations. He developed a technique specifically designed to be quick and easy, which also made it crude and imprecise. He operated on children. He performed multiple lobotomies on the same patients when initial procedures failed. He continued performing lobotomies even after effective psychiatric medications became available in the 1950s, and he defined success in ways that minimized the profound losses many patients experienced: their creativity, their emotional depth, their sense of self. The truth likely lies somewhere between these extremes. Freeman was neither a monster nor a misunderstood hero. He was a physician working in an era when psychiatric treatment options were extremely limited, driven by a genuine desire to help, but also by ambition, and a conviction that sometimes bordered on zealotry. He saw the suffering in psychiatric hospitals and wanted to do something about it. But his solution caused its own form of suffering, and he was often unwilling to fully acknowledge the harm his procedures caused. What makes Freeman's story particularly significant is what it reveals about the relationship between medical innovation and ethical responsibility. Freeman believed he was innovating, developing a procedure that could help more people by making it simpler and more accessible. But in simplifying the procedure, he also made it more dangerous and less precise. In making it accessible, he also made it easier to perform without adequate evaluation of whether patients would truly benefit. His focus on treating as many people as possible sometimes seemed to override careful consideration of whether treatment was appropriate in individual cases. Freeman's story also raises questions about how we evaluate medical success. He counted patients as successes if they became calmer and more manageable, even if they also lost the ability to live independently or experience the full range of human emotion. This definition of success served institutional needs, making patients easier to care for, more than it served patients' own interest in living full, meaningful lives. The question of who defines success in medical treatment and whose interest that definition serves remains relevant today. Finally, Freeman's career illustrates the importance of checks and balances in medical practice. For much of his career, Freeman operated with minimal oversight. He was not a surgeon, yet he performed surgery. He developed a new technique and began using it widely without rigorous testing. He continued practicing even when colleagues raised concerns. The regulatory and ethical frameworks that might have constrained his practice were either absent or inadequately enforced. His story helped demonstrate the need for stronger oversight of medical procedures, clearer standards for informed consent, and more robust protections for vulnerable patients. The question of whether Freeman was a pioneer or a zealot may never be fully resolved. Perhaps he was both a physician who genuinely wanted to help, who developed a procedure that did benefit some patients, but who also caused tremendous harm and was unwilling to fully confront the damage his work inflicted. His legacy is the thousands of people whose lives he touched, some who were helped, many who were harmed, and all who were part of one of medicine's most controversial chapters. Thalidomide, the sedative pill and global disaster. Freeman's story showed us how individual physicians can cause harm despite good intentions. Now we turn to a tragedy that involved not a single doctor, but an entire pharmaceutical industry and regulatory system. On October 1, 1957, the German pharmaceutical company Chemie Grünenthal released a new drug called Contergan. The active ingredient was thalidomide, a compound that had been synthesized in 1954 by one of the company's chemists. Thalidomide was marketed as a sedative and sleeping pill, but what made it particularly attractive was its apparent safety profile. In animal tests, researchers had been unable to find a lethal dose. Even extremely high amounts didn't kill the test animals. The company concluded that thalidomide was remarkably safe, perhaps the safest sedative ever developed. This perceived safety became the drug's primary selling point. Grünenthal marketed Contergan as suitable for everyone, including pregnant women and children. The advertising emphasized that the drug was non-toxic and could not cause fatal overdoses, a significant advantage over barbiturates, which were commonly used as sedatives, but were dangerous in high doses. Within months, Contergan was available in pharmacies across West Germany, often sold without a prescription. It quickly became one of the country's best-selling medications. The drug's success led to rapid international expansion. Pharmaceutical companies in other countries licensed thalidomide and sold it under various brand names. In the United Kingdom, it was marketed as Distaval, in Canada as Kevidon, in Australia as Distaval and other names. By 1960, thalidomide was available in more than 40 countries. It was particularly popular among pregnant women, as doctors prescribed it to relieve morning sickness, the nausea and vomiting common in early pregnancy. What no one knew was that thalidomide could cross the placental barrier. The assumption at the time was that the placenta protected the developing fetus from most substances in the mother's bloodstream. This assumption was wrong. Thalidomide not only crossed the placenta, but had devastating effects on fetal development, particularly when taken during a critical window in the first trimester of pregnancy. Let's consider what began to happen in the late 1950s. Doctors in West Germany started noticing an unusual pattern. Babies were being born with severe limb malformations, a condition called phocomelia, from the Greek words for seal limbs. In phocomelia, the long bones of the arms and legs fail to develop properly. In severe cases, hands or feet might be attached directly to the torso, with little or no arm or leg in between. The condition was extremely rare before 1959. Medical literature documented only a handful of cases worldwide. But suddenly, doctors were seeing multiple cases. At first, these cases seemed like isolated anomalies. Phocomelia could have various causes, and without a clear pattern, it was difficult to identify a common factor. But as more cases appeared, some physicians began to suspect an environmental cause. In Hamburg, Germany, pediatrician Wedekind Lenz began investigating. He interviewed mothers of affected babies, asking detailed questions about their pregnancies, what they had eaten, what medications they had taken, what exposures they might have had. A pattern emerged. Many of the mothers had taken Contergan during early pregnancy. Lenz presented his findings to Grunenthal in November 1961, urging the company to withdraw the drug. The company was skeptical. They pointed out that millions of people had taken thalidomide without apparent harm. They questioned whether the correlation Lenz had found was truly causal. But Lenz was convinced, and he went public with his concerns. Around the same time in Australia, obstetrician William McBride was making similar observations. He had noticed an increase in babies born with limb malformations at the hospital where he worked. Like Lenz, he began investigating and found that many affected mothers had taken thalidomide. McBride wrote to the Distillers Company, which manufactured the drug in Australia, and also to the medical journal, The Lancet, warning about the connection. The evidence was mounting. In November 1961, Grunenthal withdrew Contergan from the German market. Other countries followed, though, at different speeds. The United Kingdom withdrew thalidomide in December 1961. Other nations took longer. By the end of 1962, thalidomide had been withdrawn from most markets worldwide. But the damage was done. The scale of the tragedy became clear over the following years. Researchers estimate that between 10,000 and 20,000 babies were born with thalidomide-related birth defects worldwide. The actual number may be higher. Some babies died shortly after birth, and in some countries, records were incomplete. Many more pregnancies ended in miscarriage or stillbirth. The drug's effects were most severe when taken between the 20th and 36th days after conception, a critical period for limb development, when many women don't yet know they're pregnant. The birth defects varied in severity. Some children were born with relatively minor abnormalities, shortened fingers or toes. Others had severe phocomelia, with virtually no arms or legs. Some had internal organ defects, malformed hearts, kidneys, or digestive systems. Many had hearing impairment or facial paralysis. The most severely affected babies often didn't survive infancy. Those who did faced lives of significant disability in an era when support services and adaptive technologies were limited. Moving forward to the question of how this happened, we need to examine the drug testing and approval processes of the 1950s. By modern standards, thalidomide was inadequately tested before release. The animal studies that Grunenthal conducted didn't include tests on pregnant animals, the kind of reproductive toxicology studies that are now standard. The clinical trials in humans were limited and didn't specifically evaluate safety in pregnancy. The company relied heavily on the fact that they couldn't find a lethal dose in animals, interpreting this as evidence of overall safety. Regulatory oversight varied by country. In West Germany, where thalidomide was first marketed, drug regulation was relatively lax. Companies could bring drugs to market without extensive government review. Other countries had different systems, but few had rigorous requirements for testing drugs' effects on fetal development. The assumption was that if a drug was safe for adults, it was generally safe for pregnant women. There was one notable exception. In the United States, thalidomide was never approved for general sale. The drug company Richardson Merrill had applied for approval from the Food and Drug Administration in 1960. The application was assigned to Dr. Frances Oldham Kelsey, a newly hired FDA reviewer. Kelsey had concerns about the application. She noted that some patients in the United Kingdom had reported peripheral neuritis nerve damage after taking thalidomide. She felt the company hadn't adequately investigated this side effect. She also questioned the study's quality and asked for more data. Richardson Merrill pressured Kelsey to approve the drug. Company representatives contacted her repeatedly, arguing that thalidomide was already safely used in dozens of countries. But Kelsey held firm, continuing to request additional information. Her persistence meant that when reports of birth defects began emerging in late 1961, thalidomide had still not been approved in the United States. Only about 17 American babies were affected born to mothers who had received the drug as part of clinical trials or obtained it while traveling abroad. Kelsey's caution had prevented a much larger tragedy in the United States. The thalidomide disaster led to major changes in drug regulation worldwide. In the United States, Congress passed the Kefauver-Harris Amendment in 1962, significantly strengthening the FDA's authority. The new law required that drugs be proven both safe and effective before approval. It mandated more rigorous testing, including studies of drugs' effects on reproduction and fetal development. It required that patients in clinical trials give informed consent. Similar reforms were implemented in other countries. The tragedy also changed medical practice and public awareness. Doctors became more cautious about prescribing medications to pregnant women. The principle that pregnancy requires special consideration in drug safety became firmly established. Pharmaceutical companies began conducting extensive reproductive toxicology studies. The field of teratology, the study of birth defects and their causes, expanded significantly. For the families affected by thalidomide, the aftermath was long and difficult. In many countries, survivors and their families fought for compensation from the pharmaceutical companies. In West Germany, Grunenthal eventually established a foundation to provide financial support to victims, though many felt the compensation was inadequate. In the United Kingdom, a protracted legal battle ended with a settlement in 1968. Other countries had similar struggles with varying outcomes. Many thalidomide survivors have lived full lives despite their disabilities. They have advocated for disability, rights challenged societal assumptions about disability, and demonstrated remarkable resilience. Organizations of thalidomide survivors have worked to ensure that the tragedy is remembered and that its lessons continue to inform drug safety policy. Interestingly, thalidomide itself has found new medical uses. In the 1960s, an Israeli doctor discovered that thalidomide was effective in treating a painful condition associated with leprosy. Later research found that it had anti-cancer properties and could treat multiple myeloma, a blood cancer. Today, thalidomide and related drugs are used to treat several conditions, but under extremely strict controls. Patients who might become pregnant must use multiple forms of contraception and undergo regular pregnancy testing. The drug is dispensed through special programs with extensive safeguards. What does the thalidomide tragedy reveal about medicine regulation and the relationship between innovation and safety? First, it demonstrates that safety cannot be assumed, it must be rigorously tested. The fact that thalidomide seemed safe in initial studies didn't mean it was safe in all circumstances. The specific vulnerability of the developing fetus wasn't apparent until the drug was used by pregnant women. Second, the tragedy highlights the importance of regulatory oversight. In countries with weak regulation, thalidomide reached the market quickly, but with inadequate testing. In the United States, where one determined FDA reviewer insisted on more evidence, a much larger tragedy was prevented. This doesn't mean regulation should prevent all innovation, but it does mean that independent review and high standards for evidence are essential. Third, thalidomide shows how the effects of medical errors can extend across generations. The children born with thalidomide-related disabilities have lived with those effects for their entire lives. Some have had children of their own raising families while managing significant physical limitations. The tragedy affected not just individuals, but families and communities. Finally, this story reminds us that vigilance must be ongoing. The reforms implemented after thalidomide have prevented similar tragedies, but new challenges continually emerge. Each new drug, each new technology requires careful evaluation. The lessons of thalidomide, the importance of thorough testing, the need for regulatory oversight, the recognition that pregnant women and developing fetuses require special protection, remain relevant today. The price of forgetting these lessons would be measured in human suffering, just as it was in the early 1960s when the first thalidomide babies were born. Frances Kelsey, the woman who saved America from thalidomide. We've seen how thalidomide caused tragedy across much of the world. But in the United States, the story unfolded differently, thanks to one person's careful attention and quiet determination. On August 1st, 1960, Frances Oldham Kelsey arrived for her first day of work at the Food and Drug Administration's headquarters in Washington, D.C. She was 46 years old, a physician and pharmacologist with a doctorate in pharmacology from the University of Chicago. She had spent years in academic research and teaching before deciding to join the FDA. The position was relatively junior. She was one of 7 full-time and 4 part-time reviewers responsible for evaluating new drug applications. Her starting salary was modest. It was not the kind of job that typically leads to national recognition. Within weeks of starting, Kelsey was assigned her first major case, an application from William S. Merrill Company, a pharmaceutical firm based in Cincinnati, for approval of a drug called Kevadon. The active ingredient was thalidomide. Merrill had licensed the drug from the German company Chemie Grünenthal and was eager to bring it to the American market. The application emphasized that thalidomide was already approved and widely used in Europe, Canada, and other countries. The company expected quick approval perhaps within 60 days, which was the FDA's target time frame for reviewing applications. Kelsey began her review by carefully reading through the application materials. Merrill had submitted studies conducted in Europe showing that thalidomide was effective as a sedative and appeared to be safe. The company emphasized the drug's low toxicity, the fact that even large doses hadn't proven fatal in animal studies. This safety profile was thalidomide's main selling point, but as Kelsey examined the data, she found the application incomplete. The studies were not as rigorous as she expected. Some were poorly designed, others lacked adequate controls. The data on the drug's absorption, distribution, and excretion in the human body was limited. Let's consider what happened next. On November the 10th, 1960, Kelsey sent a letter to Merrill declining to approve the application. She outlined her concerns and requested additional information. The company was surprised and frustrated. They had expected approval, not a request for more data. But they submitted additional materials and reapplied. Kelsey reviewed the new submission. She still had concerns. In late 1960, she came across a letter in the British Medical Journal describing cases of peripheral neuritis, nerve damage causing numbness and tingling in the extremities, in patients who had taken thalidomide for extended periods. This was troubling. If the drug could damage nerves in adults, what might it do to a developing fetus? Kelsey asked Merrill for more information about this side effect and about the drug's safety in pregnancy. The company's response was dismissive. They argued that the cases of peripheral neuritis were rare and not definitively linked to thalidomide. They pointed out that the drug was being used safely by millions of people in other countries. They suggested that Kelsey was being unnecessarily cautious, holding up approval of a beneficial medication over minor concerns. But Kelsey was not persuaded. She continued to request additional data. Merrill submitted the application again in February 1961. Kelsey found the new information insufficient. She declined approval again. The company resubmitted in March. Kelsey declined again in April. This pattern continued through the spring and summer of 1961. Moving forward to the pressure Kelsey faced, we need to understand that her position was becoming increasingly difficult. Merrill was a respected pharmaceutical company with political connections. Company representatives began contacting Kelsey's superiors at the FDA complaining about the delays. They contacted members of Congress. They argued that Kelsey was being unreasonable, that she was preventing American patients from accessing a safe and effective medication that was already available worldwide. Some of Kelsey's colleagues at the FDA questioned whether she was being too cautious. The drug had been on the market in other countries for years without major problems being reported. Was she holding it to an unreasonably high standard? Kelsey later recalled feeling isolated at times, uncertain whether her concerns were justified or whether she was indeed being overly cautious. But she trusted her scientific judgment. The data simply wasn't adequate to establish safety, particularly for pregnant women. Then in November 1961, everything changed. Reports began emerging from Europe of babies being born with severe birth defects, particularly phocomelia. Researchers in Germany and Australia were linking these defects to thalidomide use during pregnancy. The news reached the United States quickly. Suddenly, Kelsey's caution was vindicated. The drug she had refused to approve was causing a catastrophe in other countries. Merrill immediately withdrew its application for thalidomide approval. The company also faced a troubling revelation. While waiting for FDA approval, Merrill had distributed thalidomide to more than 1,200 American doctors as part of clinical trials. These doctors had given the drug to their patients, including some pregnant women. Merrill had to track down all the doctors and patients who had received the drug and ensure that no one was still taking it. The FDA investigation found that approximately 2.25 million tablets had been distributed to about 20,000 patients. Among them were several hundred pregnant women. The outcome in the United States was far better than in Europe, but not without tragedy. Approximately 17 American babies were born with birth defects attributable to thalidomide children, whose mothers had received the drug through the clinical trials. This was a tiny fraction of the thousands affected in other countries, but for those 17 families, the impact was devastating. Still, Kelsey's persistence had prevented a much larger catastrophe. The story became national news. In July 1962, the Washington Post published a front-page article about Kelsey's role in keeping thalidomide off the American market. The article portrayed her as a hero who had stood firm against corporate pressure and saved countless American children from birth defects. Other newspapers picked up the story. Kelsey, who had been a relatively unknown civil servant, suddenly found herself famous. On August 7, 1962, President John F. Kennedy presented Kelsey with the President's Award for Distinguished Federal Civilian Service, one of the highest honors the government can bestow on a civil servant. In his remarks, Kennedy praised Kelsey's exceptional judgment and noted that her work had prevented a major tragedy. Kelsey, characteristically modest, emphasized that she had simply been doing her job, carefully evaluating the evidence and insisting on adequate data before approving a new drug. The thalidomide case had immediate policy implications. Congress was already considering legislation to strengthen the FDA's authority over drug approval. The Kefauver-Harris Amendment, which had been debated for months, suddenly had overwhelming support. The law was passed in October 1962, just weeks after Kelsey received her award. The amendment required that drugs be proven effective, not just safe before approval. It mandated more rigorous testing, including studies of drugs' effects on reproduction and fetal development. It required that patients in clinical trials give informed consent and be informed if they were receiving an experimental drug. It gave the FDA greater authority to regulate drug manufacturing and to withdraw drugs from the market if safety concerns emerged. Kelsey continued working at the FDA for another 45 years, eventually becoming director of the Division of Scientific Investigations. She helped develop many of the policies and procedures that now govern drug testing and approval. She retired in 2005 at age 90. She died in 2015 at age 101, having witnessed the transformation of drug regulation that her careful work had helped inspire. What does Frances Kelsey's story reveal about the relationship between individual action and institutional responsibility first? It demonstrates that individual integrity and professional competence matter enormously. Kelsey was not in a position of great power. She was a junior reviewer facing pressure from a pharmaceutical company, from her own colleagues, and indirectly from political figures. She could have approved thalidomide as regulators in dozens of other countries had done. The path of least resistance would have been to accept the company's assurances and grant approval. But she trusted her scientific judgment and insisted on adequate evidence. Second, Kelsey's story shows the importance of regulatory independence. The FDA's structure allowed her to make decisions based on scientific evidence rather than political or commercial pressure. Her superiors supported her even when that support was uncomfortable. This independence is essential for effective regulation. Without it, regulatory agencies become rubber stamps for industry rather than protectors of public health. Third, this case illustrates how regulatory standards evolve in response to experience. Before thalidomide, drug approval processes in most countries were relatively lax. The assumption was that if a drug seemed safe in initial testing, it could be marketed widely. The thalidomide tragedy demonstrated that this assumption was wrong, that more rigorous testing, particularly for effects on fetal development, was essential. The reforms that followed created the framework for modern drug regulation. Finally, Kelsey's story reminds us that preventing harm is often invisible. The thousands of American children who were never born with thalidomide-related birth defects because the drug wasn't approved, they and their families will never know what was prevented. This is the nature of successful prevention, the disasters that don't happen, the suffering that is avoided. It's harder to recognize and celebrate than responding to crises, but it's no less important. Frances Kelsey didn't set out to be a hero. She was simply a careful scientist, doing her job with integrity and thoroughness. But in doing so, she demonstrated that individual action, grounded in expertise and guided by ethical principles, can make an enormous difference. Her legacy is not just the American children who were spared thalidomide's effects, but the stronger regulatory system that protects all of us from inadequately tested drugs. It's a legacy built on quiet competence, professional integrity, and the courage to say no when the evidence isn't sufficient, even when saying yes would be easier. Mercury medicine, toxic metal, considered a miracle drug. Frances Kelsey's story showed us how modern regulation can protect against harmful drugs. But for centuries before such safeguards existed, medicines were used based on tradition rather than evidence, and few substances illustrate this better than mercury. In the early 1800s, a physician examining a patient with syphilis would likely prescribe a treatment that had been used for centuries: mercury. The patient might be given mercury pills to swallow mercury ointment, to rub on their skin, or be placed in a sealed room to inhale mercury vapors. The treatment would continue for weeks or months. The patient's mouth would become sore, their gums would swell and bleed, their teeth would loosen and fall out. They would salivate excessively, producing up to a quart of saliva per day. Their breath would smell metallic. These symptoms were not seen as side effects, but as signs that the treatment was working, that the mercury was driving the disease from the body. Mercury, also called quicksilver for its liquid silvery appearance, at room temperature, has fascinated humans for millennia. Ancient Chinese alchemists believed it could extend life and grant immortality. The first emperor of China, Qin Shi Huang, is believed to have died from mercury poisoning after consuming mercury pills meant to make him immortal. In ancient Greece and Rome, mercury was used in ointments and cosmetics. The Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder described mercury's properties in his encyclopedia, noting both its unusual physical characteristics and its use in medicine. But it was in the treatment of syphilis that mercury found its most widespread medical application. Syphilis appeared in Europe in the late 15th century, spreading rapidly and causing devastating symptoms. The disease progressed through stages beginning with sores, advancing to rashes and lesions, and in its late stages causing damage to the heart, brain, and other organs. There was no effective treatment, and the disease was often fatal. Let's consider how mercury became the standard treatment. In the early 16th century, physicians began experimenting with mercury compounds to treat syphilis. The reasoning was based on the medical theories of the time, which held that diseases were caused by imbalances in the body's humors. Mercury being a powerful substance that caused visible effects, salivation purging was thought to expel the disease from the body. When some patients seemed to improve after mercury treatment, this was taken as confirmation of its effectiveness. The reality was more complex. Syphilis is caused by a bacterium Treponema pallidum, though this wouldn't be discovered until 1905. The disease progresses through distinct stages, with periods of active symptoms, alternating with periods of latency when symptoms diminish or disappear. When a patient's symptoms improved after mercury treatment, physicians attributed this to the mercury, but the improvement likely reflected the natural course of the disease, rather than the treatment's effectiveness. Meanwhile, the mercury was causing its own damage to the kidneys, the nervous system, and other organs. The treatment regimens were harsh. One common method was salivation therapy. The patient would be given mercury until they began to salivate profusely, a sign of mercury poisoning, though physicians interpreted it as therapeutic. This would continue for weeks. Another method involved mercury fumigation. The patient would sit in a closed cabinet or room while mercury was heated, producing vapors that they would inhale. A third approach used mercury ointments rubbed vigorously into the skin until absorbed. A saying from the era captured the grim reality of syphilis treatment. A night with Venus, a lifetime with Mercury. Venus was the Roman goddess of love, and the phrase referred to the brief pleasure of sexual contact followed by a lifetime of mercury treatment for the resulting syphilis infection. The saying acknowledged that the treatment itself was a lifelong burden. Mercury wasn't used only for syphilis. Calomel, or mercurous chloride, became one of the most widely used medicines of the 18th and 19th centuries. It was prescribed as a laxative, as a treatment for fever, and as a general purgative, a substance meant to cleanse the body by inducing vomiting and diarrhea. Physicians gave calomel to patients with almost any ailment. Parents gave it to children for teething pain, constipation, or general illness. The drug was so common that most households kept it on hand. The effects of chronic mercury exposure were severe. Patients developed a condition called erethism, characterized by irritability, anxiety, depression, and social withdrawal. They experienced tremors, involuntary shaking of the hands and limbs. Their teeth fell out and their gums receded. They developed kidney damage. In severe cases, they suffered neurological damage that was permanent. Moving forward to a specific occupational group, we find that hat makers were particularly affected by mercury exposure. In the 18th and 19th centuries, mercury compounds were used in the process of turning animal fur into felt for hats. Workers would treat the fur with a solution containing mercury nitrate, then work the treated fur into felt. This process called carroting because it turned the fur-orange exposed workers to mercury vapors day after day, year after year. Hat makers developed characteristic symptoms of chronic mercury poisoning. They became irritable and anxious. They developed tremors so severe that they had difficulty performing their work. Some experienced hallucinations or delusions. The condition became so well known that it entered the language. The phrase, mad as a hatter, referred to the mental disturbances caused by occupational mercury exposure. Lewis Carroll's character, the Mad Hatter, in Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, published in 1865, may have been inspired by this phenomenon. Historical figures were not immune to Mercury's effects. Abraham Lincoln, during his years as a lawyer and politician, suffered from what he called melancholy, what we would now recognize as depression. He took a medication called blue mass, a pill containing mercury, which was commonly prescribed for depression and various other conditions. Some historians have suggested that Lincoln's documented mood swings, irritability, and other symptoms may have been exacerbated by chronic mercury exposure from this medication. He reportedly stopped taking blue mass shortly after becoming president, possibly because he noticed it made him irritable. The decline of mercury in medicine came gradually as understanding of its toxicity grew. In the mid-19th century, some physicians began questioning whether mercury treatment for syphilis was truly effective. They noted that patients often seemed to suffer more from the treatment than from the disease itself. But mercury use persisted, supported by centuries of tradition and by physicians' belief that they were seeing positive results. The development of alternative treatments helped end mercury's dominance. In 1910, Paul Ehrlich developed salvarsan, an arsenic-based compound that was actually effective against syphilis. Though salvarsan had its own toxicity issues, it represented a genuine advance, a treatment based on scientific understanding of the disease rather than on traditional theory. In 1943, penicillin was found to be highly effective against syphilis, finally providing a safe and reliable cure. For other conditions, mercury use declined as medical understanding advanced. Physicians came to recognize that calomel's purgative effects, the vomiting and diarrhea it caused, were not therapeutic, but were symptoms of poisoning. By the early 20th century, mercury had largely disappeared from medical practice, though some mercury-containing medications persisted into the mid-20th century. Today, mercury exposure is recognized as a serious health hazard. Environmental mercury contamination, particularly from industrial sources and coal-burning power plants, remains a concern. Mercury accumulates in fish, and pregnant women are advised to limit consumption of certain fish species to protect fetal development. The mercury thermometers that were once ubiquitous have been largely replaced with digital alternatives to eliminate the risk of mercury exposure from broken thermometers. What does the long history of mercury in medicine reveal about medical practice and human nature? First, it demonstrates how tradition can sustain harmful practices for centuries. Mercury was used in medicine for more than 2,000 years, not because evidence showed it was effective, but because physicians believed it worked, and because the practice was passed down through generations. The visible effects of mercury salivation purging were interpreted as signs of efficacy rather than as symptoms of poisoning. Second, the mercury story shows how difficult it can be to recognize harm when it unfolds slowly. Acute mercury poisoning from a single large dose causes obvious immediate symptoms, but chronic exposure to smaller amounts causes effects that develop gradually over months or years. Patients and physicians had difficulty connecting these delayed effects to the mercury treatment, especially when the treatment had been given for a different condition. Third, this history illustrates how economic interests can perpetuate harmful practices. Mercury mining was a significant industry. Physicians built their practices around mercury treatments. Pharmaceutical companies manufactured and sold mercury compounds. All of these groups had financial interest in continuing mercury use, creating resistance to change, even as evidence of harm accumulated. Finally, the mercury story reminds us that the mere fact that a treatment has been used for a long time doesn't mean it's effective or safe. Traditional medicine, passed down through generations, can contain genuine wisdom, but it can also preserve practices that cause more harm than good. Distinguishing between the two requires careful observation, rigorous testing, and willingness to abandon cherished beliefs when evidence shows they're wrong. The patients who suffered mercury poisoning in the name of treatment, who lost their teeth, their health, sometimes their lives, paid a high price for medicine's slow progress toward evidence-based practice. Their experience, like that of those who underwent bloodletting or lobotomy, reminds us that medical tradition must always be subject to scientific scrutiny, and that the question, does this treatment actually help, must be answered with evidence, not assumption. Cocaine, from wonder drug to addictive substance. Mercury's story showed us how a toxic substance could be used medicinally for centuries. Now we turn to a drug that seemed promising, at first endorsed by leading physicians before its dangers became clear. In July 1884, a 28-year-old Viennese neurologist named Sigmund Freud published a paper titled Über Coca, on coca. In it, he enthusiastically described the effects of cocaine, an alkaloid extracted from the leaves of the South American coca plant. Freud had been experimenting with cocaine on himself for several months. He found that it elevated his mood, increased his energy, and helped him work longer hours. He wrote that cocaine could treat depression, digestive disorders, and morphine addiction. He called it a magical drug and suggested it had enormous therapeutic potential. Freud was not the first to recognize cocaine's effects. Indigenous peoples in South America had chewed coca leaves for thousands of years, using them to combat fatigue, hunger, and altitude sickness. Spanish conquistadors in the 16th century observed this practice and noted the leaves' stimulating properties. But it wasn't until 1860 that German chemist Albert Niemann successfully isolated cocaine from coca leaves, creating a pure, concentrated form of the active compound. By the 1880s, cocaine was being studied by researchers across Europe and America. The drug had several properties that made it medically interesting. It was a powerful local anesthetic when applied to tissue. It numbed the area, blocking pain signals. This made it valuable for surgery, particularly eye surgery, where general anesthesia was risky. Karl Koller, a colleague of Freud's, demonstrated cocaine's use as a local anesthetic in eye surgery in 1884, and the technique was quickly adopted by surgeons worldwide. But cocaine also had systemic effects when taken internally. It stimulated the central nervous system, producing feelings of energy, confidence, and euphoria. Users reported enhanced mental clarity and physical endurance. These effects led physicians to prescribe cocaine for a wide range of conditions: fatigue, depression, nervous exhaustion, and various other ailments. Let's consider Freud's personal involvement with cocaine. He began using it himself in April 1884, taking small doses dissolved in water. He found the effects pleasant and believed the drug was helping him work more productively. He recommended it to his fiancée, Martha Bernays, suggesting it would help with her digestive problems and low spirits. He sent cocaine to his sisters. He prescribed it to patients in his medical practice. One of these patients was Ernst von Fleischl-Marxow, a colleague and friend who had become addicted to morphine after taking it for chronic pain from a thumb injury. Freud believed cocaine could help Fleischl overcome his morphine addiction. He gave Fleischl cocaine and encouraged him to use it whenever he felt the urge for morphine. Initially, this seemed to work. Fleischl reduced his morphine use. But within months, he had developed a severe cocaine addiction. He was taking enormous doses, up to 1 gram per day, far more than Freud had recommended. He experienced paranoid delusions and hallucinations. His health deteriorated rapidly. He died in 1891 at age 45, his death hastened by years of cocaine use. Fleischl's tragedy was a personal blow to Freud and a professional embarrassment. Other physicians began criticizing Freud's promotion of cocaine, pointing out cases of addiction and toxicity. Freud defended his work, but gradually distanced himself from the subject. In later years, he rarely mentioned his cocaine research and seemed uncomfortable when others brought it up. But while Freud was retreating from cocaine advocacy, the drug was becoming widely available in commercial products. Pharmaceutical companies recognized cocaine's marketability and began incorporating it into various medicines. Parke-Davis, one of America's largest pharmaceutical firms, sold cocaine in multiple forms, as a powder in tablets, in solution for injection, and in a form that could be smoked. Their advertisements claimed cocaine could supply the place of food, make the coward brave the silent eloquent, and render the sufferer insensitive to pain. Cocaine was added to tonics and patent medicines. Vin Mariani, a popular wine made by French chemist Angelo Mariani, contained coca leaf extract, approximately 6 milligrams of cocaine per fluid ounce. The wine was endorsed by prominent figures including Pope Leo XIII, who awarded Mariani a gold medal, and Thomas Edison, who praised its effects. Advertisements featured testimonials from satisfied users who credited the wine with improving their health and vitality. Moving forward to perhaps the most famous cocaine-containing product we find, that in 1886, Atlanta pharmacist John Pemberton created a beverage he called Coca-Cola. The original formula contained extracts from coca leaves, and thus cocaine, along with caffeine from cola nuts. Pemberton marketed it as a patent medicine that could cure headaches and relieve fatigue. The amount of cocaine in early Coca-Cola was relatively small. Estimates suggest around 9 milligrams per glass, but it was present nonetheless. The company removed cocaine from the formula in 1903, though it continued to use coca leaf extract with the cocaine removed. Cocaine was marketed in products aimed at various demographics. There were cocaine lozenges for sore throats, cocaine drops for toothaches, and cocaine-laced tonics for children. Some products were explicitly marketed to help people overcome alcohol or opium addiction, replacing one addiction with another, though this wasn't recognized at the time. The medical community's enthusiasm for cocaine began to wane as reports of problems accumulated. Physicians documented cases of addiction, noting that patients who used cocaine regularly developed tolerance. They needed increasingly large doses to achieve the same effects. When they tried to stop, they experienced withdrawal symptoms, including depression, fatigue, and intense cravings. Some users developed paranoid psychosis, experiencing delusions and hallucinations. Others suffered cardiovascular problems. Cocaine increased heart rate and blood pressure, and high doses could cause heart attacks or strokes. Deaths from cocaine overdose began to be reported. In some cases, these were accidental users taking too much while seeking the drug's pleasurable effects. In other cases, they were the result of medical treatment, physicians administering cocaine as a local anesthetic without realizing how much had been absorbed into the bloodstream. The line between a therapeutic dose and a toxic dose was narrower than many doctors had realized. Public concern about cocaine grew in the early 20th century. Newspaper articles described cocaine addiction as a social problem, particularly in urban areas. Some reports were sensationalized, playing on racial and class prejudices, but they reflected genuine concern about the drug's effects. The medical consensus shifted from viewing cocaine as a wonder drug to recognizing it as a dangerous substance that required careful control. Regulatory action followed. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 required that medicines containing cocaine listed on the label, making consumers aware of what they were taking. The Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914 placed strict controls on cocaine, requiring that it be dispensed only by prescription, and imposing taxes and regulations on its manufacture and distribution. These laws didn't eliminate cocaine use, but they did remove it from over-the-counter products and reduce its medical use to specific limited applications. Cocaine's legitimate medical use continued in one area as a local anesthetic, particularly for procedures involving the nose, throat, and eyes. For these applications, cocaine's ability to both numb tissue and constrict blood vessels made it uniquely useful. But even here it was gradually replaced by synthetic alternatives, like procaine, novocaine, and lidocaine, which provided similar anesthetic effects without cocaine's addictive properties or systemic toxicity. Freud's later attitude toward his cocaine research is revealing. In his autobiography, written in 1925, he mentioned his early work on cocaine, but downplayed his role in promoting it as a general therapeutic agent. He emphasized his colleague Kahler's discovery of cocaine's use in eye surgery, a legitimate contribution, while glossing over his own broader claims about the drug's benefits. He never fully acknowledged the harm that resulted from his enthusiastic promotion of cocaine, though his experience with Fleischl must have troubled him. What does the cocaine story reveal about the relationship between medical innovation and caution? First, it demonstrates how initial enthusiasm for a new treatment can obscure potential dangers. Cocaine's immediate effects, increased energy, elevated mood pain, relief were obvious and impressive. Its long-term effects, addiction, toxicity, psychological problems took time to become apparent. Physicians like Freud, impressed by the short-term benefits, promoted the drug widely before understanding its full range of effects. Second, the cocaine episode shows how personal experience can mislead. Freud used cocaine himself and found it helpful. This personal experience convinced him of the drug's value and led him to recommend it confidently to others. But individual responses to drugs vary, and what works for one person may harm another. Freud's positive experience didn't predict Fleischl's catastrophic addiction, nor did it reveal the problems that would emerge with widespread use. Third, this history illustrates the importance of systematic, long-term study before widely deploying new treatments. The early research on cocaine was largely anecdotal, physicians trying it on themselves or their patients and reporting the results. There were no controlled studies, no systematic tracking of outcomes, no careful assessment of risks versus benefits. When problems emerged, they were initially dismissed as isolated cases rather than recognized as patterns indicating fundamental issues with the drug. Finally, the cocaine story reminds us that commercial interests can amplify medical enthusiasm and delay recognition of harm. Pharmaceutical companies had financial incentives to promote cocaine products. They emphasized benefits and minimized risks in their advertising. They created products that made cocaine widely available, including to people who had no medical supervision. The profit motive, combined with inadequate regulation, allowed cocaine to be marketed far more broadly than medical evidence justified. Today, cocaine is recognized as a powerfully addictive stimulant with significant health risks. Its medical use is extremely limited, but the story of how it went from being hailed as a miracle drug to being recognized as dangerous remains relevant. It reminds us that new treatments, no matter how promising they initially appear, require careful, systematic evaluation before widespread use. It shows us the importance of regulatory oversight to protect people from premature or excessive medical claims. And it demonstrates that even brilliant physicians working with the best intentions can make serious errors when enthusiasm outpaces evidence. Heroin, Bayer's cough medicine, becomes an epidemic. Cocaine showed us how a drug could go from medical miracle to controlled substance. Now we examine an even more potent example, a drug specifically designed to be safer than its predecessor, but which became one of the most devastating substances in medical history. In August 1897, a chemist named Felix Hoffmann was working in the laboratories of Friedrich Bayer and Company in Elberfeld, Germany. Hoffmann was part of a team searching for new pharmaceutical compounds. That month, he synthesized two substances that would have very different legacies. One was acetyl salicylic acid, which Bayer would market as aspirin, destined to become one of the safest and most useful drugs ever created. The other was diacetylmorphine, a chemical modification of morphine. Bayer would call this second compound heroin. The name came from the German word heroisch, meaning heroic or powerful. Early test subjects reported feeling strong and heroic after taking the drug, but the name also reflected Bayer's ambitions for the compound. The company believed it had created a heroic solution to a serious medical problem, morphine addiction. Morphine derived from opium had been widely used as a painkiller since the early 19th century. It was highly effective, but it had a significant drawback. It was powerfully addictive. Patients who took morphine regularly developed tolerance, requiring higher doses to achieve the same effect. When they tried to stop, they experienced severe withdrawal symptoms. By the 1890s, morphine addiction was recognized as a serious problem. Physicians were searching for an alternative, something that could provide morphine's pain-relieving benefits without its addictive properties. Diacetylmorphine seemed promising. In initial tests, it appeared to be more effective than morphine at suppressing coughs and relieving respiratory distress. It was also more potent. A smaller dose produced similar effects. Bayer's researchers believed they had found a safer alternative to morphine. The company began marketing heroin in 1898, initially as a cough suppressant and treatment for respiratory ailments, including bronchitis, asthma, and tuberculosis. Let's consider how heroin was marketed and used. Bayer promoted it aggressively, distributing free samples to physicians and advertising it in medical journals. The company emphasized that heroin was non-addictive, a claim based on limited testing and wishful thinking rather than rigorous evidence. Advertisements showed children taking heroin for coughs and colds. The drug was available in various forms as a powder in tablets and in liquid elixirs. In many countries, it could be purchased without a prescription. Heroin was, indeed, effective as a cough suppressant. It worked by suppressing the cough reflex in the brain. For patients with chronic coughs from tuberculosis or other respiratory diseases, this provided real relief. The drug also produced a sense of well-being and reduced anxiety effects that patients and doctors interpreted as signs of healing. The medical community embraced heroin enthusiastically. Between 1898 and 1910, medical journals published numerous articles praising the drug. Physicians reported using it successfully for various conditions. Some even suggested it could help morphine addicts overcome their addiction, replacing morphine with what they believed was a non-addictive alternative. This reasoning seems absurd in hindsight, but it reflected genuine belief that heroin was fundamentally different from morphine. But within a few years, troubling reports began to emerge. Patients who used heroin regularly were developing the same problems seen with morphine tolerance and dependence. They needed increasingly large doses to achieve the same effects. When they tried to stop, they experienced withdrawal symptoms that were, if anything, more severe than morphine withdrawal. Some patients who had been given heroin to treat morphine addiction simply became addicted to heroin instead. Moving forward to the medical community's response, we find that recognition of heroin's addictive properties came gradually and unevenly. Some physicians noticed problems early and stopped prescribing the drug. Others continued to use it, either unaware of the risks or believing that addiction only occurred when the drug was misused. Bayer itself was slow to acknowledge the problem. The company had invested heavily in heroin production and marketing. Admitting that the drug was addictive would mean acknowledging a costly mistake. By 1910, heroin addiction was becoming impossible to ignore. Hospitals were admitting patients suffering from heroin dependence. Some were medical patients who had been prescribed the drug and become addicted. Others had begun using heroin recreationally, attracted by its powerful euphoric effects. The drug had begun to spread beyond medical use into recreational use particularly in urban areas. The regulatory response varied by country. In the United States, the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914 placed heroin under strict controls, requiring prescriptions and limiting its distribution. Other countries implemented similar restrictions. In 1913, Bayer stopped manufacturing heroin. By 1924, the United States had banned heroin production, entirely making it illegal to manufacture, import, or possess the drug except for very limited research purposes. But prohibition came too late to prevent heroin from becoming a street drug. By the time governments banned it, heroin had already established itself in the illicit drug market. Underground laboratories began producing it, and criminal networks distributed it. The drug that Bayer had marketed as a safe cough remedy had become a major contributor to addiction and crime. The irony of heroin's history is particularly striking when we consider Felix Hoffmann's other synthesis from 1897. Aspirin, the compound he created just weeks before or after heroin. The exact sequence is debated, became one of the most successful drugs in history. It's safe when used as directed effective for pain and fever, and has been used by billions of people over more than a century. Heroin, created in the same laboratory by the same chemist, became a symbol of pharmaceutical failure and the dangers of inadequate drug testing. What went wrong with heroin? The fundamental error was assuming that chemical modification of morphine would eliminate its addictive properties. Heroin is actually converted back to morphine in the body. It's essentially a more potent form of morphine that crosses into the brain more easily. The chemical modification that Bayer's researchers thought would make the drug safer actually made it more dangerous. The testing that Bayer conducted before releasing heroin was inadequate by modern standards. The company tested the drug on animals and on a small number of human subjects for short periods. These tests showed that heroin was effective as a cough suppressant and didn't immediately cause obvious problems. But they didn't reveal what would happen with longer-term use. The addictive properties of opioids only become apparent after repeated use over weeks or months. Bayer's brief trials didn't last long enough to detect this. There was also a failure of critical thinking. Heroin is chemically very similar to morphine. Morphine was known to be addictive. The assumption that a minor chemical modification would eliminate addictiveness should have been treated with skepticism. But the desire to find a non-addictive painkiller and the commercial opportunity such a drug represented seems to have overridden caution. The heroin story also illustrates how commercial interests can shape medical practice. Bayer had financial incentives to promote heroin. The company invested in manufacturing facilities, marketing campaigns, and distribution networks. These investments created pressure to continue selling the drug, even as evidence of problems accumulated. When physicians raised concerns, the company defended heroin rather than immediately investigating whether those concerns were valid. The long-term consequences of heroin's introduction have been profound. Today, more than a century after Bayer stopped manufacturing it, heroin remains a major public health problem. It's estimated that millions of people worldwide are addicted to heroin or other opioids. The drug contributes to crime disease transmission and thousands of deaths annually from overdose. Recent decades have seen a resurgence in opioid addiction, driven partly by prescription painkillers that, like heroin, were initially marketed as safer alternatives to earlier drugs. What does the heroin story reveal about pharmaceutical development and drug safety? First, it demonstrates that good intentions and scientific credentials are not sufficient safeguards against harmful outcomes. Bayer was a respected pharmaceutical company. Hoffmann was a trained chemist. The company's researchers genuinely believed they had created a beneficial drug. But belief is not the same as evidence, and initial impressions can be misleading. Second, the heroin case shows the importance of adequate testing before releasing new drugs. The testing that would have revealed heroin's addictive properties Long-term studies with careful monitoring of patients wasn't conducted until after the drug was already widely available. By the time the problems became apparent, many people had already become addicted. Third, this history illustrates how difficult it can be to reverse course once a drug has been released. Even after heroin's problems became known, it took years to remove it from medical practice and decades to address the addiction problem it had created. The drug spread into illicit markets meant that banning medical use didn't eliminate the problem. It just shifted it to a context where it was even harder to control. Finally, the heroin story reminds us that pharmaceutical innovation always carries risks. Every new drug is an experiment to some degree. We can test carefully, we can try to anticipate problems, but we cannot predict with certainty how a drug will behave when used by millions of people over many years. This uncertainty means that caution, careful monitoring, and willingness to acknowledge mistakes are essential. Bayer's failure with heroin wasn't just a failure of testing, it was a failure to respond quickly enough when problems emerged, and a failure to prioritize patient safety over commercial interests. The contrast between aspirin and heroin, two drugs created by the same chemist in the same year, serves as a powerful reminder of how unpredictable pharmaceutical development can be. One became a blessing used safely by billions. The other became a curse causing immeasurable suffering. The difference wasn't in the intentions of those who created them, but in the properties of the compounds themselves, and in how carefully they were tested and monitored. It's a lesson that remains relevant every time a new drug is developed. Electroshock therapy. Electric shock to treat mental illness. Heroin demonstrated how a pharmaceutical product could cause lasting harm. Now we turn to a psychiatric treatment that remains controversial to this day, one that has saved lives, but also carries the burden of a troubling history. In the spring of 1938, two Italian psychiatrists, Ugo Cerletti and Lucio Bini, were searching for a new treatment for severe mental illness. They had been experimenting with inducing seizures in patients, a technique called convulsive therapy, using drugs like camphor and metrazole. The theory was that seizures might somehow reset the brain and alleviate psychiatric symptoms. But drug-induced seizures were unpredictable and frightening for patients. Cerletti and Bini wanted a more controlled method. The inspiration came from an unlikely source. Cerletti had visited a slaughterhouse in Rome, where he observed pigs being rendered unconscious with electric shocks before being killed. He realized that electricity could induce seizures in a controlled, predictable way. Working with Bini, an engineer as well as a physician, Cerletti developed a device that could deliver carefully measured electrical currents to the human brain. On April 15, 1938, they performed the first electroconvulsive therapy treatment on a human patient. The man was 39 years old, found wandering the Rome railway station, speaking incoherently. Police had brought him to the psychiatric clinic. He had been diagnosed with schizophrenia. Cerletti and Bini explained the procedure to him, though it's unclear how much he understood. They placed electrodes on his temples and delivered a brief electrical current about 70 volts for a fraction of a second. The patient's muscles tensed, but he didn't have a full seizure. Cerletti increased the voltage and tried again. This time the patient experienced a grand mal seizure. His body convulsed for about a minute. When he regained consciousness, he was confused but calmer. Over the following weeks, he received additional treatments. His symptoms improved. He was eventually discharged from the hospital, able to return to his previous life. Cerletti and Bini considered the treatment a success. Let's consider how electroconvulsive therapy ECT spread from this single case to worldwide use. Cerletti and Bini published their results in 1938. The psychiatric community took notice. Here was a treatment that seemed to help patients with severe mental illness conditions for which few effective treatments existed. By 1940, ECT was being used in psychiatric hospitals across Europe and North America. By 1950, it had become one of the most common treatments for severe depression, schizophrenia, and other psychiatric conditions. The procedure in those early years was crude by modern standards. Patients were typically awake during treatment. They would be held down by staff members. Electrodes would be placed on their temples and an electrical current would be passed through their brain for a fraction of a second. The patient would immediately lose consciousness and experience a seizure. Their muscles would contract violently. Sometimes bones would break from the force of the muscle contractions. Patients might bite their tongue or cheek. After the seizure ended, they would gradually regain consciousness, confused, and with no memory of the procedure itself. Many patients found the experience terrifying. Even though they didn't remember the seizure itself, the anticipation of treatment caused severe anxiety. Some patients had to be forcibly restrained for treatment. The memory loss that often followed ECT patients might forget events from the hours or days before treatment added to the distress. Moving forward to the question of effectiveness, we find that ECT did seem to help some patients, particularly those with severe depression. Patients who had been suicidal, unable to eat or care for themselves, sometimes showed remarkable improvement after a series of ECT treatments. For these patients and their families, ECT could be life-saving. But the treatment was also used much more broadly on patients with various diagnoses, and the results were often less impressive. The problem was that ECT was being used in an era when psychiatric diagnosis was imprecise and treatment options were limited. Patients with depression, schizophrenia, mania, and various other conditions all received ECT. Some improved, some didn't. There was little understanding of why the treatment worked when it did, or which patients were most likely to benefit. Worse ECT began to be used not just as treatment, but as a form of control. In overcrowded psychiatric hospitals, where staff struggled to manage difficult or disruptive patients, ECT became a tool for maintaining order. Patients who were uncooperative or violent might be threatened with ECT or given treatments as punishment. This use of ECT as a behavior control measure rather than a therapeutic intervention represented a serious ethical violation, but it occurred with disturbing frequency in mid-20th century psychiatric institutions. The public perception of ECT was shaped significantly by its portrayal in popular culture. The 1975 film One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, based on Ken Kesey's 1962 novel, depicted ECT as a form of torture used to control and punish patients. While the film was fiction, it reflected real abuses that had occurred in psychiatric hospitals. The image of ECT as a brutal, dehumanizing procedure became fixed in public consciousness. This negative perception persisted even as the procedure itself was being refined. Starting in the 1950s, modifications made ECT safer and less traumatic. Patients began to be given general anesthesia, so they were unconscious during the procedure. Muscle relaxants were administered to prevent the violent muscle contractions that could cause injuries. The electrical current was carefully calibrated and delivered more precisely. Modern ECT, as practiced from the 1960s onward, bore little resemblance to the early procedures. Research on ECT continued, and a clearer picture of its effects emerged. Studies found that ECT was most effective for severe depression, particularly in patients who hadn't responded to medication or who were acutely suicidal. The treatment seemed to work by inducing changes in brain chemistry, affecting neurotransmitters, and possibly promoting the growth of new neural connections. The seizure itself appeared to be the therapeutic element, though exactly why seizures helped some psychiatric conditions remained unclear. Today, ECT is still used, but under very different conditions than in the past. It's typically reserved for severe cases patients with life-threatening depression, who haven't responded to other treatments, or patients with certain forms of psychosis or catatonia. The procedure is performed under general anesthesia with muscle relaxants. The electrical current is precisely controlled and delivered through electrodes placed to minimize side effects. Patients are carefully monitored before, during, and after treatment. Modern ECT is generally considered safe, though it's not without side effects. The most common is memory loss. Patients may have difficulty remembering events from around the time of treatment. For most people, this memory loss is temporary, but some patients report persistent memory problems. There's ongoing debate about how common and how severe these long-term effects are. The question of whether ECT should be used at all remains contentious. Some psychiatrists and patients view it as an essential treatment that can save lives when nothing else works. They point to studies showing that ECT can be highly effective for severe depression, with response rates higher than many medications. Others argue that the treatment is inherently harmful, that the memory loss and other side effects are unacceptable, and that the history of abuse surrounding ECT means it should be abandoned entirely. Patient advocacy groups are divided. Some organizations of people with mental illness support the availability of ECT as a treatment option, while others campaign for it to be banned. Survivors of psychiatric treatment who underwent ECT in earlier decades, when the procedure was more traumatic and sometimes used inappropriately, often speak out against it. Their experiences are real and deserve acknowledgement, even as the procedure itself has changed. What does the history of ECT reveal about psychiatric treatment and medical ethics? First, it demonstrates how a treatment can be both helpful and harmful, depending on how it's used. ECT has genuinely helped some patients. There are people alive today who credit ECT with saving their lives. But the treatment has also been misused, causing harm to patients who didn't benefit from it or who received it inappropriately. Second, ECT's history illustrates the dangers of using medical treatments for social control. When psychiatric treatments are used to manage behavior rather than to help patients, medicine becomes a tool of coercion. The use of ECT as punishment in psychiatric hospitals was a betrayal of medical ethics, and it contributed to the treatment's negative reputation. Third, the ECT story shows how difficult it can be for a treatment to overcome a troubled past. Even though modern ECT is very different from the procedure used in the 1940s and 1950s, it still carries the stigma of that earlier era. Public perception, shaped by historical abuses and cultural depictions, doesn't easily change, even when the underlying reality has changed. Finally, ECT raises questions about informed consent in psychiatric treatment. Many patients who receive ECT today do so voluntarily after being informed about the risks and benefits. But some patients receive ECT involuntarily when they're deemed unable to make decisions for themselves due to severe mental illness. The ethics of administering a treatment that causes memory loss to someone who cannot consent is complex and troubling, even when the treatment might save their life. The story of electroconvulsive therapy is not simply one of medical error or abuse. It's more complicated than that. ECT has helped some people and harmed others. It has been used appropriately and misused. It represents both the potential of psychiatric treatment to alleviate suffering and the dangers of medical interventions that affect the brain and mind. The treatment continues to be used, continues to be debated, and continues to carry the weight of its history, a history that cannot be separated from discussions of whether and how ECT should be employed today. Insulin shock therapy, coma for treatment. Electroshock therapy showed us a treatment that remains in use despite its troubled past. Now we examine a psychiatric treatment that was eventually abandoned entirely. one based on an accidental observation and sustained by hope rather than evidence. In 1927, a Viennese physician named Manfred Sackel was treating a patient who was addicted to morphine. As part of the treatment, Sackel administered insulin to help manage the patient's symptoms. Insulin, discovered just a few years earlier, was primarily used to treat diabetes, but some doctors were experimenting with it for other conditions. On one occasion, Sackel accidentally gave his patient too much insulin. The patient's blood sugar dropped dangerously low, and she fell into a coma. Sackel quickly administered glucose to revive her. When she regained consciousness, something unexpected had happened. Her mental state seemed improved. She appeared calmer and more lucid than before the coma. Sackel was intrigued. He began deliberately inducing insulin comas in other patients, particularly those with schizophrenia. He theorized that the coma somehow reset the brain, alleviating psychiatric symptoms. In 1933, he published his findings, reporting remarkable success rates, claiming that up to 70% of his schizophrenia patients showed significant improvement. The psychiatric community, desperate for effective treatments for this devastating illness, took notice. Insulin shock therapy, also called insulin coma therapy, spread rapidly through psychiatric hospitals in Europe and North America. By the late 1930s, it was being used in major institutions across the developed world. By the 1940s, thousands of patients were undergoing the treatment annually. It became for a time the standard treatment for schizophrenia. Let's consider what the treatment actually involved. A patient would be given an injection of insulin in the morning on an empty stomach. The dose was carefully calculated to lower blood sugar to the point of inducing coma, but not so much as to cause immediate death. As the blood sugar dropped, the patient would progress through several stages. First came sweating and restlessness, then confusion and disorientation. Eventually, as blood sugar continued to fall, the patient would lose consciousness and enter a coma. The patient would remain in this comatose state for anywhere from 15 minutes to an hour. During this time, they required constant monitoring. Their vital signs could become unstable. They might have seizures. After the prescribed time in the coma, medical staff would administer glucose, either as a drink if the patient could be partially roused or through a tube into the stomach, or by injection. The glucose would raise blood sugar levels, and the patient would gradually regain consciousness. This process was repeated multiple times per week, for weeks or months. A typical course of treatment might involve 50 to 60 insulin comas. The treatment required intensive medical supervision. Nurses and doctors had to monitor patients continuously during the coma phase, ready to intervene if complications arose. Special insulin coma units were established in psychiatric hospitals, with dedicated staff trained in the procedure. The risks were substantial. Approximately 1 to 2% of patients died during insulin shock therapy. The causes of death varied. Some patients went into comas so deep they couldn't be revived. Others had seizures that caused brain damage or respiratory failure. Some developed other medical complications. Beyond mortality, there were other serious risks. Patients could suffer permanent brain damage from prolonged low blood sugar. They could have seizures that caused injuries. The repeated comas could affect memory and cognitive function. Moving forward to the question of why this dangerous treatment became so widely adopted, we need to understand the context of psychiatric care in the 1930s and 1940s. Schizophrenia was a devastating illness with no effective treatment. Patients often spent years or decades in psychiatric hospitals, their symptoms unrelieved. Families watched their loved ones deteriorate. Doctors felt helpless. When Sackel reported success with insulin shock therapy, it offered hope where none had existed. The treatment also had institutional appeal. Psychiatric hospitals were overcrowded and underfunded. Insulin shock therapy, while labor-intensive, was less expensive than long-term hospitalization. If it could cure or significantly improve patients' conditions, allowing them to be discharged, it would reduce the burden on these institutions. Hospital administrators and government officials had incentives to believe the treatment worked. But did it actually work? This question is more complicated than it might seem. Sokal and other early practitioners reported high success rates. They published case studies of patients who improved dramatically after insulin shock therapy. Some patients did seem to get better. Their hallucinations decreased. Their thinking became clearer. They were able to leave the hospital. However, there were significant problems with this evidence. The studies were not controlled. There was no comparison group of patients who didn't receive the treatment. Schizophrenia is a variable illness. Some patients improve spontaneously, regardless of treatment. The criteria for improvement were subjective and often vague, and there was strong bias toward reporting successes while downplaying or ignoring failures. When more rigorous studies were conducted in the 1950s and 1960s, the results were disappointing. Controlled trials comparing insulin shock therapy to other treatments or to no treatment at all found little evidence that it was effective. Some studies found no difference in outcomes between patients who received insulin shock therapy and those who received supportive care without the comas. The treatment that had been hailed as a breakthrough appeared to be no more effective than a placebo. Why then had so many doctors believed it worked? Several factors contributed to this collective error. First, there was the power of suggestion and expectation. Doctors who believed the treatment would help convey that belief to patients and families. Patients who expected to improve sometimes did, at least temporarily, a placebo effect. Second, the natural course of schizophrenia includes periods of remission when symptoms decrease. Improvements that occurred during or after treatment were attributed to the treatment, even if they would have happened anyway. Third, there was publication bias. Studies showing positive results were more likely to be published than studies showing no effect. Doctors who had invested time and resources in insulin shock therapy had professional incentives to report success. And fourth, there was simply the desperate hope that anything could help these suffering patients. Doctors wanted to believe they had found an effective treatment. The decline of insulin shock therapy came gradually. The introduction of chlorpromazine in 1952, the first effective antipsychotic medication, provided an alternative that was safer and easier to administer. As more psychiatric medications became available through the 1950s and 1960s, the use of insulin shock therapy decreased. The accumulating evidence that it wasn't actually effective also contributed to its abandonment. By the 1970s, insulin shock therapy had largely disappeared from psychiatric practice. Today, insulin shock therapy is remembered as a cautionary tale. It represents a treatment that was widely adopted based on inadequate evidence that exposed patients to serious risks, and that was ultimately shown to be ineffective. The thousands of patients who underwent the treatment, enduring repeated comas, risking death and brain damage, did so for a therapy that likely provided no real benefit. What does the history of insulin shock therapy reveal about medical practice and the evaluation of treatments? First, it demonstrates the danger of relying on anecdotal evidence and uncontrolled observations. Sokal's initial reports seemed compelling. Patients appeared to improve after treatment. But without controlled studies, it was impossible to know whether the treatment caused the improvement or whether patients would have improved anyway. Second, this history shows how desperation can override scientific rigor. Faced with a devastating illness and no effective treatments, doctors were willing to try something dramatic and risky. The desire to help patients combined with institutional and professional pressures led to the widespread adoption of a treatment before it had been properly tested. Third, the insulin shock therapy story illustrates the importance of controlled clinical trials. Only when researchers conducted studies comparing insulin shock therapy to other treatments or to no treatment did it become clear that the therapy wasn't effective. This realization helped drive the development of more rigorous standards for evaluating psychiatric treatments. Finally, this case reminds us that good intentions are not enough. The doctors who administered insulin shock therapy genuinely believed they were helping their patients. They were not cruel or indifferent. They were trying to treat a terrible illness with the tools available to them. But their good intentions didn't make the treatment effective or justify the risks to which patients were exposed. The legacy of insulin shock therapy is complex. It caused harm. Patients died, suffered brain damage, or experienced trauma from the repeated comas. Yet it also represented an attempt to treat seriously ill patients at a time when few options existed. The treatment's failure ultimately contributed to better methods for evaluating psychiatric treatments and to the development of medications that actually do help people with schizophrenia. The patients who underwent insulin shock therapy, who trusted their doctors, who hoped for recovery, who endured repeated comas in pursuit of healing, deserve to be remembered. Their experience reminds us that medical treatments must be rigorously tested before widespread use, that hope and belief are not substitutes for evidence, and that the history of medicine includes not just triumphs, but also well-intentioned failures that caused real harm to real people. Legacies and lessons, from mistakes to progress. We've journeyed through some of medicine's darkest chapters, from ancient trepanation to insulin shock therapy. Now, as we conclude, let's consider what these stories teach us and how their lessons continue to shape medical practice today. In a research ethics committee meeting at a major university hospital today, a group of physicians, scientists, ethicists, and patient advocates gathered to review a proposal for a clinical trial. They examined the study design carefully. They scrutinized the informed consent documents to ensure patients will truly understand what they're agreeing to. They assess the risks and benefits. They discuss whether vulnerable populations are adequately protected. This careful review process, now standard at every institution conducting medical research, exists because of the tragedies we've explored. The modern framework for medical ethics and research oversight didn't emerge from abstract philosophical principles. It was built piece by piece in response to specific failures and tragedies. Each disaster left a legacy of forms designed to prevent similar harm in the future. Let's consider the specific legacies of the cases we've examined. The thalidomide tragedy of the early 1960s fundamentally changed how drugs are tested and approved. Before thalidomide, pharmaceutical companies could bring drugs to market with relatively limited testing. The assumption was that if a drug seemed safe in initial trials, it could be widely sold. Thalidomide shattered that assumption. In the United States, the Kefauver-Harris Amendment of 1962 required that drugs be proven both safe and effective before approval. It mandated more extensive testing, including studies specifically examining effects on reproduction and fetal development. It required that patients in clinical trials be informed they were receiving an experimental drug and give their consent. Similar reforms were implemented in other countries. Today, before a drug reaches the market, it typically undergoes years of testing, first in laboratory studies, then in animal studies, then in carefully controlled human trials with increasing numbers of participants. The Radium Girls case had a different but equally important legacy. Their lawsuit established legal principles that still protect workers today. It affirmed that employers have a duty to provide safe working conditions and to inform workers about hazards they might face. It established that companies can be held liable for occupational diseases, even when those diseases don't manifest until years after exposure. The case contributed to the development of workers' compensation systems and occupational safety regulations. Moving forward to the legacy of lobotomy and other psychiatric treatments, we find reforms focused on patient rights and informed consent. The widespread use of lobotomy, often on patients who couldn't meaningfully consent, highlighted the vulnerability of psychiatric patients. This led to the development of stronger protections. Today, psychiatric patients have legal rights to refuse treatment in many circumstances. The concept of informed consent has been elaborated and strengthened. Patients must be told about risks, benefits, and alternatives, and their consent must be voluntary and based on understanding. The various cases of drug misuse, mercury, cocaine, heroin, contributed to the development of pharmaceutical regulation and controlled substance laws. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 and subsequent legislation established government oversight of drug manufacturing and marketing. The Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914 and later laws created systems for controlling dangerous drugs. These regulatory frameworks, though imperfect, provide important safeguards. Today, any research involving human subjects must be reviewed and approved by an institutional review board or ethics committee. These committees include not just scientists and physicians, but also ethicists, community members, and patient advocates. They evaluate whether the research is scientifically sound, whether risks are minimized and justified by potential benefits, whether participant selection is fair, and whether informed consent procedures are adequate. Clinical trials must follow strict protocols. Participants must be given detailed information about the study, including its purpose, procedures, risks, and benefits. They must be told that participation is voluntary and that they can withdraw at any time without penalty. Their consent must be documented. During the trial, an independent data safety monitoring board reviews results periodically to ensure participant safety. If serious problems emerge, the trial can be stopped. But challenges remain. Commercial pressures still influence medical research and practice. Pharmaceutical companies fund much of the research on new drugs, creating potential conflicts of interest. Studies funded by companies are more likely to report favorable results than independent studies, a bias that can skew medical knowledge. Regulatory agencies like the FDA, while more rigorous than in the past, still face pressure to approve drugs quickly, particularly for serious diseases with few treatment options. Let's consider the global dimension of these challenges. In wealthy countries with strong regulatory systems, patients have significant protections. But in lower-income countries, oversight may be weaker. Some pharmaceutical companies have conducted clinical trials in developing countries where regulations are less stringent, and participants may be less able to give truly informed consent. This raises ethical questions about exploitation and about whether the benefits of research are fairly distributed. The rise of alternative and complementary medicine presents another challenge. Many alternative treatments have not been rigorously tested. They're often marketed with health claims based on tradition or anecdotal evidence rather than controlled studies. Regulatory oversight of these products is generally weaker than for conventional drugs. This creates a situation somewhat reminiscent of the early 20th century, when patent medicines with unproven claims were widely sold. The COVID-19 pandemic illustrated both how far medical science has come and how tensions between speed and caution persist. Vaccines were developed with unprecedented speed, a genuine achievement. But this speed also raised concerns. How could we be sure the vaccines were safe when they were developed so quickly? The answer was that rigorous testing continued, but processes that normally occurred sequentially were conducted in parallel, and regulatory review happened in real time rather than after all data were collected. The vaccines underwent the same types of testing as any other vaccine, just faster. Yet the pandemic also showed how misinformation can spread, how public trust in medicine can be fragile, and how difficult it is to communicate uncertainty. Some people rejected vaccines based on fears reminiscent of past medical tragedies, concerns about unknown long-term effects, distrust of pharmaceutical companies, skepticism about regulatory oversight. These concerns, while often exaggerated, weren't entirely irrational. They reflected an awareness that medicine has made serious mistakes in the past. What principles should guide medicine going forward? The history we've explored suggests several essential lessons. First, humility is crucial. Medical knowledge is always incomplete. Treatments that seem effective may later prove harmful. New discoveries may overturn current understanding. Physicians and researchers must remain open to the possibility that they're wrong. Second, evidence must take precedence over belief. Many of the treatments we've examined persisted because people believed they worked, despite limited evidence. Bloodletting continued for centuries, based on theoretical reasoning rather than empirical testing. Insulin shock therapy was widely used based on anecdotal reports rather than controlled studies. Modern medicine's commitment to evidence-based practice making decisions based on rigorous research rather than tradition or authority is essential. Third, patient welfare must be the primary concern. Commercial interests, professional ambition, institutional convenience. All of these can create pressures that compromise patient care. The Radium Girls were harmed because their employer prioritized profit over safety. Lobotomy was sometimes used to make patients easier to manage rather than to help them. Maintaining focus on patient welfare requires constant vigilance. Fourth, informed consent is fundamental. Patients have the right to make decisions about their own care based on accurate information about risks and benefits. This principle seems obvious now, but it was hard-won. Many of the patients harmed by the treatments we've discussed never had the opportunity to make informed choices. Finally, regulatory oversight and ethical review are necessary safeguards. Individual physicians and researchers, no matter how well-intentioned, can make errors or be influenced by biases. Independent review by regulatory agencies, ethics committees, and the broader scientific community provides essential checks and balances. The stories we've explored are not just historical curiosities. They're part of the foundation of modern medical ethics and practice. The suffering of those who underwent bloodletting, who were poisoned by mercury or radium, who received lobotomies, or insulin shock therapy, who were harmed by thalidomide or heroin. Their experiences taught lessons that protect patients today. The Radium Girls who fought for justice, Kelsey who stood firm against pressure to approve thalidomide, the researchers who conducted rigorous studies showing that cherished treatments didn't actually work. Their contributions shaped the medical system we have now. This system is imperfect. Mistakes still happen. Patients are still sometimes harmed by treatments meant to help them. Commercial interests still sometimes override patient welfare. But the framework of protections, rigorous testing, informed consent, ethical oversight, regulatory review makes medicine safer than it has ever been. The responsibility now falls to each generation of physicians, researchers, and healthcare workers to maintain these protections, to learn from past mistakes, and to remain vigilant against new forms of error. The history of medicine's dark chapters is not just a record of what went wrong. It's a guide to what we must continue to guard against: the tendency to act on insufficient evidence, to prioritize convenience over safety, to let enthusiasm override caution, to forget that behind every medical decision is a human being whose welfare must come first. As we close this exploration of medicine's troubled past, we carry forward not just knowledge of what happened, but understanding of why it matters. These stories remind us that medical progress is built not only on successes, but on the painful lessons learned from failures. They remind us that the ethical principles and regulatory safeguards we sometimes find burdensome exist for good reason. And they remind us that the question, "Are we doing the right thing?" must be asked continuously, honestly, and with humility, because the cost of failing to ask it is measured in human suffering. Over the past 2.5 hours, we've traveled through some of the most difficult chapters in medical history. We began with trepanation, that ancient surgery where healers drilled into the skull with stone tools, achieving survival rates that would surprise us today. We examined bloodletting, a practice sustained for 2,000 years by theory rather than evidence. We encountered radium, celebrated as a miracle substance, before its deadly nature became clear, and heard the story of the Radium Girls, whose suffering led to the workplace protections we benefit from today. We explored lobotomy, a procedure that won a Nobel Prize, yet left thousands permanently damaged. We met Walter Freeman, whose story raises difficult questions about the line between innovation and recklessness. We witnessed the Thalidomide tragedy that affected tens of thousands of children worldwide, and learned how Kelsey's quiet determination spared America from the worst of that disaster. We saw how Mercury, cocaine, and heroin, each once prescribed by respected physicians, caused harm that lasted generations. We examined electroshock therapy and insulin shock therapy treatments that reflected both genuine attempts to help and the dangers of acting without adequate evidence. And we reflected on what these stories teach us about medical progress, about the importance of evidence, and ethics, about the protections that now safeguard patients. What emerges from these stories is not a simple narrative of progress from darkness to light. Medical history is more complex than that. We've seen how intelligent, well-intentioned people can make serious errors, how treatments can persist for centuries despite causing harm, how commercial interests can override patient welfare, how desperation in the face of suffering can lead to acceptance of dangerous interventions. But we've also seen how each tragedy left a legacy. The thalidomide disaster gave us stronger drug testing requirements. The Radium Girls lawsuit established workers' rights. The abuses of lobotomy and other psychiatric treatments led to informed consent protections. The misuse of mercury, cocaine, and heroin contributed to pharmaceutical regulation. Each mistake, each failure, each life lost or damaged taught lessons that now protect others. This history matters because it reminds us that medical knowledge is always incomplete, always evolving. The treatments we use today will someday be viewed as primitive, just as we now view bloodletting or mercury therapy. What seems obviously right can later prove wrong. What appears safe can turn out to be dangerous. This awareness, this humility about the limits of our knowledge, is itself a form of protection. It matters because it shows us that progress requires vigilance. The safeguards we have: rigorous testing, informed consent, ethical review, regulatory oversight exist because people fought for them, often after suffering harm. Maintaining these protections requires constant attention. New challenges emerge. Commercial pressures persist. The temptation to act on insufficient evidence remains. And it matters because behind every medical decision is a human being. The patients who underwent these treatments were not statistics or case studies. They were people with hopes and fears, with families who loved them, with lives that mattered. The Radium Girls who painted watch dials. The patients who received lobotomies. The children affected by thalidomide. The workers poisoned by mercury. Their experiences are part of medical history, and remembering them is an act of respect and a commitment to doing better. History is not static. New discoveries continue to reshape our understanding. Researchers still study the remains of trepanation patients, learning about ancient surgical techniques. The graves of Radium Girls still emit measurable radiation, providing data about long-term radiation effects. Survivors of thalidomide continue to advocate for disability rights and drug safety. The lessons from these dark chapters remain relevant as medicine faces new challenges, new technologies, new treatments, new ethical questions. Perhaps we're drawn to these stories because they reveal something fundamental about the human condition. They show us people trying to heal, to help, to understand, and sometimes failing, sometimes causing harm despite good intentions. They remind us that progress is not inevitable, that knowledge must be earned through careful observation and honest acknowledgement of error. They demonstrate both human fallibility and human resilience, the capacity to learn from mistakes and build something better. Thank you for spending this time exploring these difficult but important stories. If you found value in this journey through medical history, there are other explorations available when you're ready. But for now, let these stories settle. Let the lessons they contain become part of how you understand the world. May you rest peacefully with gratitude for the protections that now exist, with respect for those who suffered to teach us these lessons, and with hope that each generation of healers will learn from the past and do better. Rest well.